Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a Europe that would be almost impossible to recognize. Long before kingdoms, long before cities, and long before anyone had the luxury of complaining about slow internet connections, this continent belonged to a world of ice, wind, and survival. A world where winters could last for what must have felt like forever, where enormous animals wandered across open plains, and where one of humanity's closest relatives carved out an existence against staggering odds. Tonight, we're stepping into the harsh world of the Neanderthals. So before we begin, let's you get comfortable, settle into your favorite sleeping position, and allow yourself to drift back tens of thousands of years into a landscape unlike anything most of us have ever experienced. The Ice Age world demanded attention, and the people who lived within it became remarkably skilled at understanding its patterns. Every day began with an awareness of the environment because the environment was always making decisions on your behalf. The weather determined where you traveled. The movement of animals determined where you hunted. The arrival of winter determined how carefully you needed to prepare. Nature wasn't something that existed in the background of life. It was life. If you could somehow stand in Neanderthal Europe and look across the landscape, the first thing you might notice would be the emptiness. Modern Europe is filled with roads, towns, farms, and cities. The Neanderthal world felt vastly different. Enormous stretches of open ground extended toward distant horizons. Rivers cut through valleys untouched by bridges. Forests covered entire regions. Grasslands rolled across the continent like frozen oceans. There were no power lines, no distant engines, and no artificial lights interrupting the darkness. The silence would probably surprise you. Not complete silence, of course. Nature is never completely silent. The wind moved through grasslands. Birds called overhead. Water flowed through streams and rivers. Animals made their presence known. But there was an absence of human noise that would feel almost unsettling to modern ears. No traffic. No machinery. No conversations drifting from neighboring houses. Just the sounds of the natural world carrying across immense distances. And then there was the cold. The cold was not merely an inconvenience. It was a permanent companion. Even during relatively mild periods of the Ice Age, temperatures were often far lower than those experienced in modern Europe. Winters could be severe. Snow covered large areas of the landscape. Powerful winds swept across open plains with very little to slow them down. A person standing exposed to the elements quickly discovered that nature had no interest in comfort. For Neanderthals, surviving these conditions required constant adaptation. Every season brought new challenges. A successful hunting ground during one part of the year might become nearly useless during another. Rivers froze. Animal herds changed their migration routes. Storms transformed familiar landscapes. Nothing remained predictable forever. Yet despite these difficulties, Neanderthals didn't merely survive. They flourished. For hundreds of thousands of years they occupied regions stretching across Europe and parts of Asia. They learned the habits of animals. They understood the changing rhythms of the seasons. They developed tools, social bonds, and survival strategies that allowed them to endure in environments that would challenge even well-equipped modern adventurers. Part of what made their world so difficult was the sheer number of dangers that existed beyond the edge of every camp. Predators shared the landscape. Wolves moved through forests and grasslands. Cave lions hunted across open country. Bears occupied caves and sheltered locations. Hyenas scavenged and competed for resources. The food chain was crowded, and humans were only one participant among many. Imagine watching the sun disappear below the horizon as darkness spreads across an Ice Age valley. Temperatures begin to fall. The wind grows colder. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls. Beyond the reach of your firelight, movement becomes difficult to detect. Every sound matters because every sound might mean something. That reality shaped the way Neanderthals thought about shelter, family, and survival. Nothing could be taken for granted. A successful hunt mattered because food meant life. A reliable shelter mattered because warmth meant life. Strong social bonds mattered because cooperation meant life. Modern people often imagine survival as an individual achievement, but Ice Age survival was almost always a group effort. A lone person facing the European Ice Age would struggle tremendously. A community working together stood a much better chance. Knowledge could be shared. Resources could be distributed. Injuries could be managed. Children could be protected. And children needed protection because the world they were born into was anything but forgiving. A young Neanderthal entered a landscape filled with challenges from the very beginning. Cold weather, dangerous terrain, large animals, predators, and the constant need for resources shaped daily life. Learning happened early because it had to. Every generation inherited practical knowledge that had been accumulated through countless years of observation and experience. The landscape itself became a classroom. Children learned where water could be found. They learned which plants were useful. They learned how weather changed with the seasons. They learned how to recognize animal tracks. They learned which areas offered safety and which areas demanded caution. By modern standards, it was an extraordinarily demanding education. But in a world where survival depended on understanding nature, that education was invaluable. And as we continue our journey into Neanderthal life, we'll begin by taking a closer look at one of the most important elements of survival in this frozen world, the shelters they called home and the places where families gathered against the cold. If there is one thing the Neanderthals understood better than almost anyone who has ever lived, it was the value of a good shelter. That might not sound particularly exciting at first. After all, modern people spend most of their lives surrounded by walls, roofs, insulation, heating systems, and the comforting certainty that a snowstorm probably isn't going to blow directly into the living room. But for a Neanderthal living tens of thousands of years ago, shelter wasn't simply a place to relax after a long day. Shelter was the difference between comfort and misery, safety and danger, and sometimes even life and death. The popular image of Neanderthals usually involves caves, and to be fair, caves did play an important role in many areas. If you stumble upon a large rocky opening that already comes with walls, a ceiling, and protection from the weather, it would be foolish not to consider moving in. Even today people appreciate properties with good natural features. Neanderthals were no different. The main difference is that their real estate market occasionally involved negotiating with bears. A cave might look empty when you arrive during the afternoon, but that doesn't necessarily mean it belongs to you. Somewhere out there could be a very large animal expecting to return home later that evening. Imagine spending hours getting comfortable only to discover that the previous occupant weighs half a ton and possesses opinions about property rights that are difficult to challenge. In Ice Age Europe, that wasn't an entirely impossible situation. Still, when caves were available and safe, they provided enormous advantages. Thick stone walls blocked the wind. Rocky ceilings kept snow and rain away. Temperatures inside remained relatively stable throughout the year. During harsh winters, even a small increase in warmth could make a tremendous difference. Anyone who has ever stepped inside a cave on a hot day knows that caves have a way of creating their own environment. For Neanderthals facing brutal Ice Age conditions, that natural protection was incredibly valuable. Of course, not every Neanderthal lived in a cave, and not every region conveniently provided rocky shelters waiting to be occupied. Much of their lives were spent in open landscapes where natural caves simply didn't exist. In those places people built shelters of their own. These weren't permanent houses with neat addresses and decorative gardens. They were practical structures designed to solve immediate problems. A typical Neanderthal shelter likely looked very different depending on where it was built and what materials happened to be available. In forested regions, wood formed an important part of construction. Branches could be arranged into simple frameworks. Animal hides might then be stretched across those frameworks to block wind and retain heat. In open areas where large animals were abundant, bones from mammoths and other creatures may have been incorporated into structures. Mammoth bones are enormous, and when you're trying to build something durable in a landscape with limited resources, enormous bones begin to look surprisingly useful. Imagine approaching one of these camps from a distance. The shelter wouldn't stand out like a modern building. It would blend into the landscape. Low structures clustered near a source of water. Smoke rising from fires. Animal hides drying nearby. Stone tools scattered around work areas. The camp would look less like a village and more like a collection of carefully organized survival solutions. The location of a shelter mattered almost as much as the shelter itself. Building in the wrong place could create problems that lasted for weeks or months. Too close to a river and seasonal flooding might become a concern. Too exposed and the wind would rob valuable warmth. Too isolated from resources and daily tasks became unnecessarily difficult. Neanderthals learned to think strategically about where they settled. A good campsite offered access to water, nearby hunting opportunities, useful materials, and some degree of protection from the elements. They were essentially conducting prehistoric real estate evaluations without ever inventing real estate agents. One advantage they did have was experience. Generations of observation taught people which locations worked and which did not. Knowledge accumulated over time. Certain valleys offered shelter from prevailing winds. Certain caves remained dry during storms. Certain locations provided excellent views of surrounding terrain. These details mattered because every advantage increased the odds of surviving another season. Inside the shelter, conditions were probably crowded by modern standards. Personal space was a luxury that rarely entered the conversation. Families lived close together. Children slept near adults. Valuable tools remained within easy reach. Animal hides covered portions of the ground. Fires provided heat and light. The entire structure revolved around practicality. The fire itself often became the center of camp life. Everything seemed to orbit around it. People gathered nearby for warmth. Food was prepared there. Tools could be repaired in its light. Conversations likely took place around the flames. During winter evenings, when darkness arrived early and temperatures continued to drop, the fire transformed a cold shelter into something that felt almost welcoming. You can imagine the scene. Outside, wind pushes across the frozen landscape. Snow drifts through the darkness. Temperatures continue falling. Somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight, predators move through the night. Inside the shelter, however, there is warmth. The crackling of burning wood fills the air. Shadows dance against walls of stone, hide, or bone. Children remain close to their families. Hunters return from the day's work. For a few hours, the dangers of the outside world feel slightly more distant. That feeling of security was incredibly important because the outside world never stopped being dangerous. Storms arrived. Temperatures fluctuated. Resources changed. Every shelter represented an attempt to create a small pocket of stability within an unpredictable environment. It wasn't perfect. Roofs leaked. Smoke filled enclosed spaces. Cold still found ways to enter. But perfection wasn't the goal. Survival was. And survival often depended upon making the best use of whatever happened to be available. A fallen tree could become part of a structure. Animal hides became walls and coverings. Bones became building materials. Stones became windbreaks. The Neanderthals lived in a world where almost everything had multiple uses, and waste was a luxury nobody could afford. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about these shelters is that they reveal something important about the people who built them. They weren't simply reacting to nature. They were actively shaping their environment. They recognized problems and created solutions. They selected locations carefully. They organized living spaces. They modified landscapes to suit their needs. In short, they behaved exactly like intelligent humans trying to make life a little safer, a little warmer, and a little more comfortable. And when the freezing winds of Ice Age Europe howled outside through another long winter night, those shelters became far more than simple structures. They became homes. As important as shelter was, it would have meant very little without fire. A cave might block the wind. A hide-covered structure might keep out the snow. But when temperatures plunged deep below freezing and darkness settled across the Ice Age landscape, it was the fire that transformed a shelter from a cold hole in the ground into something that actually felt livable. For Neanderthals, fire wasn't merely a useful tool. It was a companion that followed them through every season of life. As evening approached, attention naturally shifted toward maintaining the flames. Nobody wanted to discover after sunset that the firewood supply was running low. The cold had a way of becoming much more noticeable once the sun disappeared. Throughout the day people gathered fuel whenever the opportunity presented itself. Branches, dead wood, and other burnable materials were collected and carried back to camp because everyone understood what was coming. Night always arrived eventually, and night in Ice Age Europe could be remarkably unforgiving. The sun would begin its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Temperatures that already felt cold would begin dropping even further. Winds often seemed sharper after dark, somehow finding every opening and weakness in a shelter. The familiar terrain beyond camp gradually disappeared into darkness until only the nearest landmarks remained visible. And then the fire became the center of everything. Its light pushed back the darkness. Its warmth pushed back the cold. Its presence pushed back fear. You can imagine a group gathering around the flames after a long day. Hunters returning from distant parts of the landscape. Families settling into familiar places near the fire. Children moving closer to parents as darkness spread beyond the shelter. Sparks rising upward into the night air before disappearing into the darkness above. The fire created a boundary between two very different worlds. Inside the circle of light there was warmth, companionship, and relative safety. Outside the circle of light there was uncertainty. Every civilization throughout history has understood the comforting effect of a fire at night, but for Neanderthals that comfort carried even greater significance. They weren't lighting decorative fireplaces during holiday seasons. They depended on fire in ways that modern people rarely consider. Without it, winter nights could become dangerous very quickly. Temperatures during parts of the Ice Age frequently dropped far below freezing. Even inside a shelter, cold air found ways to creep through openings and gaps. Thick animal hides provided insulation, but insulation alone wasn't enough. Heat had to come from somewhere. The fire supplied that heat, creating a warmer pocket of air where people could rest and recover from the demands of the day. Sleeping arrangements probably revolved around this source of warmth. Nobody wanted to be positioned too far away from the fire if it could be avoided. At the same time, nobody wanted to roll directly into the flames either, which would certainly create an unforgettable evening for everyone involved. Over generations people learned how to arrange sleeping spaces in ways that balanced comfort and safety. Animal hides likely covered portions of the ground. These hides served multiple purposes. They created a barrier between people and the cold earth. They provided some degree of cushioning. They trapped warmth that might otherwise be lost. Compared to modern mattresses, the experience was probably less than luxurious, but compared to sleeping directly on frozen ground, it was a tremendous improvement. Families often slept close together. This arrangement wasn't simply about affection, although family bonds were certainly important. Sleeping near one another also conserved heat. Human bodies generate warmth, and when temperatures are dropping throughout the night, every bit of warmth becomes valuable. Children especially benefited from remaining close to adults during cold conditions. If a modern person were suddenly transported into one of these shelters, the experience would likely feel both familiar and strange. Familiar because people are people. Families gathered together. Conversations took place. Meals were shared. Children stayed close to parents. But strange because nearly every aspect of life revolved around practical survival. Even sleep itself wasn't quite the same luxury many people enjoy today. The fire required attention. Someone had to make sure it didn't die. A fire going out in the middle of a freezing winter night wasn't a minor inconvenience. Rebuilding it could be difficult, especially if weather conditions were poor. Maintaining a steady source of heat often meant waking periodically to add fuel and monitor the flames. Imagine opening your eyes during the middle of the night. The shelter is quiet. Most people are asleep. The fire has burned lower than before, glowing softly beneath a layer of ash. Outside, wind rattles against the shelter walls. The darkness beyond the entrance appears endless. For a few moments the entire camp exists in a strange silence interrupted only by the occasional crackle of burning wood. Then another piece of fuel is added. A shower of sparks rises briefly. The flames grow stronger. Warmth spreads once again through the shelter. And gradually everyone settles back into sleep. These small moments likely repeated themselves countless times across thousands of years. Night after night. Winter after winter. Generation after generation. The fire became woven into the rhythm of Neanderthal life. It illuminated tool making. Cooked food. Provided protection. Offered comfort. And perhaps most importantly, it created opportunities for people to gather together after the day's work had ended. Modern humans spend evenings surrounded by distractions. Screens glow from every direction. Information arrives constantly. Entertainment is available on demand. For Neanderthals, the fire itself may have been the evening's focal point. People sat nearby because it was warm. Conversations happened because people were gathered together. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next because families shared the same space. A child watching an experienced hunter repair a tool wasn't attending a formal lesson. They were simply living. Learning happened through observation. Stories may have been shared. Experiences discussed. Plans made for the following day. The fire provided the setting for all of it. Outside, meanwhile, the Ice Age continued its endless work. Snow accumulated across the landscape. Animals moved through the darkness. Predators hunted beneath the stars. The cold remained patient and relentless. But within the shelter, surrounded by family and illuminated by dancing flames, there was something remarkably powerful. There was warmth. There was community. There was a brief escape from the harsh realities waiting beyond the firelight. And perhaps that is one of the most important things to remember about Neanderthal life. Survival wasn't only about strength. It wasn't only about hunting skills or physical endurance. It was also about creating small islands of comfort in an often unforgiving world. A shelter offered protection. A family offered support. And a fire burning steadily through a freezing night offered reassurance that when morning finally arrived, the people gathered around it would be ready to face another day. Morning arrived long before anyone invented alarm clocks, and unfortunately for the Neanderthals, the Ice Age had very little respect for sleeping in. The day began when the environment decided it was time to begin. Sometimes that meant the first pale light appearing beyond the horizon. Sometimes it meant a sudden drop in temperature that made staying asleep increasingly difficult. Sometimes it meant hearing movement outside the shelter and realizing that the world was already awake. The first moments of a Neanderthal morning probably looked very different from our own. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody checked messages. Nobody stared blankly into a refrigerator wondering what to eat for breakfast despite having plenty of options. The day began with immediate practical concerns because survival had a way of keeping priorities remarkably clear. The fire was often the first thing that demanded attention. Throughout the night the flames had slowly diminished. What remained might be glowing embers hidden beneath a blanket of ash. If the fire had survived until morning, that was good news. Starting a new fire from scratch was possible, but preserving an existing one was much easier. Before anything else happened, someone would likely encourage those embers back to life. A little fuel. A careful breath of air. A few moments of patience. Gradually the orange glow strengthened and small flames returned. Almost immediately the shelter felt different. The warmth began spreading once again. Light pushed back the remaining shadows. Another day had officially started. Outside, the landscape was waking up as well. Frost covered the ground. Cold air hung over valleys and rivers. Animals were already moving through the environment, following routines that had remained unchanged for generations. Somewhere in the distance a herd of reindeer might be crossing open ground. Birds called from nearby trees. The world wasn't waiting for anyone. For Neanderthals, mornings were often busy because every hour of daylight mattered. During winter especially, the amount of usable daylight could be frustratingly limited. The sun might seem reluctant to rise and surprisingly eager to disappear again. Wasting those precious hours simply wasn't an option. People began preparing for the day ahead. Tools needed inspection. Weapons needed checking. Plans needed discussion. A damaged spear discovered during a hunt could become a serious problem, so repairs happened whenever necessary. Stone points were examined. Wooden shafts were inspected for cracks. Equipment represented a significant investment of time and effort, and maintaining it properly made perfect sense. Meanwhile, the younger members of the group were learning simply by watching. There were no classrooms. No textbooks. No lectures. Knowledge existed in the actions of experienced people. A child observing adults prepare tools wasn't just passing time. They were receiving an education. Every movement contained information. Every decision demonstrated a skill. Over years of observation these lessons accumulated until eventually the children became the teachers of the next generation. Breakfast, when available, depended entirely on circumstances. Some mornings might begin with leftovers from previous hunts. Dried meat could provide valuable energy before a long day. Stored food was incredibly useful because successful hunting wasn't guaranteed every single day. Sometimes meals were substantial. Sometimes they were modest. The natural world rarely distributed resources according to a convenient schedule. After eating, attention shifted toward the day's objectives. Not every morning looked the same. Some days focused on hunting. Others focused on gathering resources. Tools needed replacement. Shelters required maintenance. Firewood had to be collected. Animal hides needed preparation. Water needed gathering. Life involved a continuous series of tasks, each connected to survival in some way. Imagine stepping outside a Neanderthal shelter shortly after sunrise. The cold immediately greets you. Your breath becomes visible in the air. The ground crunches beneath your feet. Across the camp people are already moving with purpose. Nobody appears rushed, but nobody appears idle either. Everyone understands their responsibilities. The rhythm of daily life has been established through countless generations of experience. Beyond the shelter the landscape stretches toward distant horizons. A river glitters beneath the morning light. Thin layers of mist cling to low ground. Animal tracks cross patches of frozen earth. To modern eyes the scene might appear intimidating. To the Neanderthals it was familiar. They understood this environment in ways that would astonish most people today. A hunter could look across a valley and notice details invisible to others. The direction of animal movement. The age of tracks. Changes in vegetation. Signs of recent activity. The landscape communicated constantly, and experienced individuals learned how to interpret its messages. Morning was often the best time to gather information because the world still carried evidence from the night before. Fresh tracks remained visible. Recent disturbances could be identified. Conditions could be evaluated before the day's activities fully began. This awareness extended to weather as well. A shift in wind direction mattered. Cloud formations mattered. Temperature changes mattered. The environment was both workplace and provider. Understanding it offered advantages that could not be ignored. As the sun climbed higher, groups gradually dispersed from the camp. Hunters traveled toward promising locations. Others focused on tasks closer to home. Children remained under supervision while learning skills appropriate for their age. The camp that felt busy only an hour earlier became quieter as people moved outward into the surrounding landscape. Yet no matter how far individuals traveled during the day, there was always an expectation of return. The shelter remained the center of community life. The fire remained the center of the shelter. Everything radiated outward from that point before eventually returning once again. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine these mornings as difficult because they lacked modern comforts. And in many ways they certainly were. There was no central heating waiting to remove the chill from the air. No stocked pantry guaranteed a reliable breakfast. No technology simplified daily chores. But there was also a certain clarity to life. The priorities were obvious. Food mattered. Warmth mattered. Family mattered. Knowledge mattered. Every morning began with those realities, just as it had for generations before and would continue to do for generations afterward. As the first sunlight spread across the Ice Age landscape and another day of challenges awaited beyond the camp, Neanderthal communities rose to meet them, not because life was easy, but because adapting to difficulty had become one of the things they did best. As people gradually disappeared into the landscape to begin the day's work, one thing connected nearly every task they performed, every journey they made, and every season they survived. It wasn't a tool. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even fire. It was the clothing they carried with them every single day. Because in a world where winter could dominate half the year and freezing winds seemed determined to test every living creature, staying warm wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Fortunately for the Neanderthals, they lived in a landscape filled with animals, and those animals provided far more than food. Every successful hunt represented an opportunity to gather resources that could be transformed into something useful. Meat fed families. Bones became tools. Tendons could be used as cordage. And the hides became clothing. Modern clothing is so common that most people rarely think about where it comes from. You walk into a store, choose something that fits reasonably well, and leave. A Neanderthal had a slightly more complicated shopping experience. First, an animal had to be hunted. Then the hide needed to be removed carefully. After that came the lengthy process of cleaning, scraping, drying, and preparing the skin so it would remain useful instead of turning into a very unpleasant-smelling problem. This process required patience. Fresh animal hides are heavy. They're messy. They're difficult to work with. And they absolutely do not arrive looking like a finished winter coat. Preparing them demanded skill that had been refined over countless generations. The inner layers needed to be cleaned. Fat and tissue had to be removed. The hide required treatment to prevent rapid deterioration. Every step mattered because a poorly prepared hide wouldn't last very long, and replacing clothing wasn't a task anyone wanted to repeat unnecessarily. Imagine a group sitting near a shelter during a relatively calm afternoon. Hunting equipment rests nearby. Children play within sight of the camp. Several adults work carefully with animal skins, scraping away unwanted material using stone tools that have been shaped specifically for this purpose. The work is repetitive, but incredibly important. Every stroke of the tool brings the hide one step closer to becoming something useful. Eventually those hides could be transformed into clothing capable of protecting people from some of the harshest weather conditions on Earth. The exact appearance of Neanderthal clothing remains one of the many mysteries of prehistory, but most researchers agree that animal skins formed the foundation of their wardrobe. Thick hides provided insulation against cold temperatures. Fur trapped warm air close to the body. Multiple layers offered additional protection when conditions became especially severe. Function mattered far more than fashion. Nobody was concerned about seasonal trends. Nobody was asking whether mammoth hide would still be popular next year. The goal was simple. Stay warm. Stay dry. Stay alive. And in that regard, animal skins performed remarkably well. A person dressed in carefully prepared hides could retain body heat far more effectively than someone relying on thin coverings. This became especially important during winter when temperatures dropped dramatically. A cold day could quickly become dangerous if clothing failed to provide sufficient protection. Neanderthals understood this reality intimately because they experienced it every year. As winter approached, the landscape changed. Days became shorter. Frost appeared more frequently. Winds carried a sharper edge. The environment seemed to remind everyone that preparation was no longer optional. Good clothing became one of the most valuable possessions a person could own. A damaged hide required repair. A torn covering demanded attention. Every piece of clothing represented many hours of labor, and nobody wanted that investment wasted. Stone tools likely played a major role in maintaining these garments. Scrapers helped prepare hides. Sharp flakes could cut materials into useful shapes. Bone tools may have assisted with joining pieces together. Over time, Neanderthals developed practical solutions to practical problems, refining techniques that improved both comfort and survival. And comfort, while perhaps not the first word people associate with Ice Age Europe, mattered more than we sometimes imagine. A warmer person could work longer. A warmer person slept better. A warmer person conserved energy. All of those advantages accumulated over time. The difference between adequate clothing and excellent clothing might seem small during a single afternoon, but over the course of an entire winter it could become enormously important. Children benefited especially from protective clothing. Young bodies lose heat more quickly than adults, making insulation particularly valuable. Parents likely devoted significant effort toward ensuring that children remained protected from the cold. A freezing child is an unhappy child in any period of history, but in the Ice Age the consequences could extend far beyond complaints and discomfort. As families traveled through the landscape, their clothing became part of their survival system. Hunters crossing open plains depended on it. Gatherers moving through forests depended on it. Anyone caught in poor weather depended on it. Animal skins accompanied people everywhere because the climate rarely allowed them to be forgotten. The fur itself probably varied depending on the animal from which it came. Some furs offered exceptional warmth. Others provided durability. Different materials likely served different purposes. Over generations people learned which hides performed best under specific conditions. This wasn't scientific research in the modern sense, but it was practical knowledge accumulated through direct experience. And practical knowledge was one of the Neanderthals' greatest strengths. They didn't survive hundreds of thousands of years by accident. They survived because they paid attention. They observed. They adapted. They remembered what worked. The clothing they created from animal skins reflects that adaptability perfectly. Every hide represented a solution to a problem. Every garment represented the ability to transform resources from the natural world into something that improved daily life. Imagine standing on an exposed hillside during the middle of winter. The wind pushes across the landscape. Snow drifts through the air. Temperatures continue falling. Without adequate clothing, the experience would become miserable almost immediately. With carefully prepared animal skins wrapped around your body, the environment remains harsh, but it becomes manageable. That distinction mattered. The Ice Age could never be conquered. It could only be endured. And through skill, patience, and generations of accumulated knowledge, Neanderthals found ways to endure it remarkably well. Their clothing may not have looked impressive by modern standards, but every stitch, every hide, and every layer represented something far more important than appearance. It represented survival. By the time winter fully arrived in Neanderthal Europe, staying warm stopped being a matter of comfort and became a matter of survival. The landscape transformed into a place that seemed actively opposed to the idea of human existence. Frost covered the ground each morning. Rivers developed sheets of ice along their edges. Snow gathered in sheltered valleys. The wind moved across open plains with a kind of relentless determination, stealing heat from anything unfortunate enough to stand in its path. For modern people, winter is often something experienced between heated buildings and warm vehicles. For Neanderthals, winter was an opponent that had to be faced every single day. Fortunately, they were remarkably good at it. One of the greatest advantages Neanderthals possessed was their own bodies. Long before they wrapped themselves in animal hides or gathered around fires, nature had already equipped them for life in cold environments. Their stocky build wasn't accidental. Their shorter limbs reduced the amount of surface area exposed to the cold. Their broad chests and powerful frames helped conserve heat. In many ways, they resembled the kinds of animals that thrive in northern climates today. Evolution had spent hundreds of thousands of years preparing them for conditions that would make most modern humans immediately start searching for a thermostat. Even so, biology could only accomplish so much. The cold always found ways to remind people that preparation mattered. Imagine stepping outside a shelter during the middle of winter. The air feels sharp enough to sting your lungs. Every breath emerges as a cloud of vapor. Snow crunches beneath your feet. The sun hangs low in the sky, providing light but very little warmth. Before long your fingers begin noticing the temperature. Your face feels exposed. Every gust of wind seems determined to discover weaknesses in your clothing. Now imagine experiencing that not for an afternoon, but for months. Year after year. Generation after generation. Neanderthals survived these conditions because they approached warmth as a complete system rather than a single solution. Clothing played an important role. Shelters played an important role. Fire played an important role. And perhaps most importantly, people themselves played an important role. Warmth was often a group effort. At night, families slept close together. This arrangement helped conserve precious body heat during the coldest hours before dawn. Modern people sometimes think of sleeping close together as a social choice. In Ice Age Europe it was also a practical decision. A group generated more warmth than any individual alone. During freezing nights, that additional heat could make a significant difference. The shelter itself contributed as well. Neanderthals didn't simply choose locations at random. Camps were often established in places that offered protection from prevailing winds. Natural barriers such as rock formations, hillsides, and caves reduced exposure to harsh weather. Even a slight reduction in wind could dramatically improve living conditions because moving air has an unfortunate habit of carrying heat away from the body. Anyone who has ever stepped outside on a windy winter day already understands this principle. 10 degrees feels cold. 10 degrees with strong wind feels personal. Neanderthals learned to avoid giving the weather unnecessary advantages. Inside the shelter, fires became the center of life during winter. Throughout the evening people gathered around the flames, absorbing warmth while carrying out the countless tasks that occupied daily life. Stone tools were repaired. Food was prepared. Animal hides were worked into clothing and coverings. Conversations took place. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Meanwhile the fire quietly performed one of the most important jobs in the entire camp. It kept people alive. A healthy fire could transform a freezing shelter into a relatively comfortable living space. Not warm by modern standards, perhaps, but significantly warmer than the landscape outside. The difference between sleeping near a fire and sleeping without one could be enormous. Naturally, this meant fuel became extremely valuable. Wood didn't gather itself. Someone had to find it, had to carry it. Someone had to ensure enough remained available for the long winter nights ahead. Imagine a group returning to camp carrying armfuls of branches gathered throughout the day. It may not look particularly dramatic compared to hunting a mammoth, but in many ways it was just as important. A camp without sufficient fire would quickly discover how unforgiving winter could become. The fire also created something else that people desperately needed during the darkest months of the year. Predictability. Outside the shelter, winter was constantly changing. Storms arrived. Temperatures dropped. Snow accumulated. Animals altered their movements. But the fire remained. Morning after morning, evening after evening, its warmth provided a small sense of stability in an otherwise unpredictable world. Animal skins added another layer of protection. Thick furs trapped warm air close to the body, creating insulation against the cold. Multiple layers could be combined when temperatures became especially severe. During particularly harsh weather, people may have wrapped themselves in additional hides while resting or sleeping. In a sense, Neanderthals carried part of their shelter with them. Wherever they traveled, their clothing formed a portable barrier between themselves and the environment. And that environment never stopped testing them. Blizzards swept across open landscapes. Freezing rain soaked exposed surfaces. Temperatures plunged during long winter nights. Yet somehow these communities continued functioning. Children grew up. Families endured. Hunters traveled across frozen terrain. Life continued. One reason it continued was because Neanderthals understood energy in a practical way, even if they would never have described it using modern scientific language. Staying warm requires calories. The body burns energy to maintain temperature. A person who is cold and underfed faces a much greater challenge than a person who is cold but well nourished. Food therefore became part of the warmth equation. Successful hunts didn't merely fill stomachs. They helped people survive the cold itself. The rich meat and fat obtained from large animals provided fuel for bodies working constantly to generate heat. During winter, every calorie mattered. The environment demanded energy, and Neanderthals responded by becoming highly skilled hunters capable of obtaining substantial resources from the landscape around them. Looking back, it is easy to focus on individual survival techniques and miss the larger picture. The reason Neanderthals stayed warm wasn't because of one brilliant invention or one miraculous adaptation. It was because dozens of different solutions worked together at the same time. Strong bodies. Warm clothing. Carefully chosen shelters. Reliable fires. Shared body heat. High-energy food. Generations of accumulated knowledge. Remove any one of those pieces and winter becomes more difficult. Combine them all together and suddenly a species can thrive in places that seem almost impossible to inhabit. And that may be the most remarkable thing about Neanderthal winters. They weren't merely surviving the cold. They were building lives within it. Children laughed around winter fires. Families shared meals. Skills were taught. Stories were likely told. Outside, the wind howled across frozen plains and snow drifted beneath ice-age skies. Inside, people adapted, endured, and carried on. For thousands upon thousands of years, winter arrived with all of its familiar hardships, and for thousands upon thousands of years, the Neanderthals found ways to meet it head-on. By the time evening settled across the landscape and the day's work finally came to an end, the most important place in the Neanderthal world wasn't a hunting ground, a river crossing, or a source of stone for tools. It was the camp itself. Because no matter how skilled a hunter became or how well someone understood the landscape, survival in Ice Age Europe was never truly an individual achievement. It was something families accomplished together. The popular image of Neanderthals often focuses on solitary figures standing dramatically in the snow with spears in hand, staring heroically into the distance as though they spent their entire lives posing for prehistoric magazine covers. The reality was probably far less dramatic and far more familiar. Most of life revolved around other people. Families lived together. Worked together. Learned together. And survived together. As darkness spread across the landscape, members of the group gradually returned to camp. Some arrived carrying gathered resources. Others brought firewood collected throughout the day. Hunters returned from distant areas, sometimes successful, sometimes not. Children who had spent the day exploring the immediate surroundings under watchful eyes drifted back toward the center of camp. Slowly the settlement became active again. Not in the noisy way of a modern city, but with the quiet activity of people settling into familiar routines. The fire brightened. Food was prepared. Tools were inspected. Conversations began. And for a little while, the challenges of the outside world remained beyond the edge of the firelight. The camp itself was much more than a collection of shelters. It was the center of social life. Every relationship existed within it. Every lesson was taught there. Every child grew up surrounded by people who collectively contributed to their survival. In many ways, the camp functioned as a small community where everyone depended on everyone else. That dependence created strong social bonds. If someone became injured during a hunt, they needed support. If a child became sick, they needed care. If food was scarce, resources had to be shared. Life in the Ice Age left very little room for selfishness because the environment was already difficult enough without people making it harder for one another. Evidence from archaeological discovery suggests that Neanderthals cared for injured and disabled individuals, sometimes for years. Some skeletons show severe injuries that would have made independent survival almost impossible. Yet those individuals continued living long after the injuries occurred. The only reasonable explanation is that other members of the group helped them. Think about that for a moment. In one of the harshest environments humans ever inhabited, people still found ways to care for one another. That tells us something important. Compassion wasn't invented by civilization. It existed long before cities, governments, or written laws. It existed around Ice Age campfires. Children occupied a particularly important place within these communities. They represented the future of the group. Every skill, every lesson, and every piece of knowledge had to be passed forward if the community hoped to continue thriving. Unlike modern childhoods filled with schools, books, and structured lessons, Neanderthal children learned by participating in daily life. Every day became a classroom. A child watching an adult repair a spear learned about tools. A child accompanying a gathering expedition learned about plants. A child observing hunters return to camp learned about animals, cooperation, and survival. Knowledge wasn't separated from life. Knowledge was life. Imagine a young Neanderthal sitting near the fire while adults work nearby. Stone tools click against one another as repairs are made. Animal hides are cleaned and prepared. Conversations drift through the shelter. The child watches everything. At first, perhaps they only observe. Later they begin helping. Small tasks become larger tasks. Simple responsibilities become important responsibilities. Years pass. The child becomes an adult. And eventually they teach the next generation exactly the same way. The entire process repeats itself. Again and again. For thousands of years. Family life also provided something less tangible but equally important. It provided stability. The Ice Age landscape could be unpredictable. Weather changed. Animal movements changed. Resources changed. But family remained. A familiar face around the fire. A parent offering guidance. A sibling sharing a task. An elder passing on knowledge. These relationships created continuity in a world where many other things remained uncertain. Evenings were likely among the most social periods of the day. With major tasks completed and darkness limiting further travel, people naturally gathered together. The fire offered warmth and light. Families sat nearby. Meals were shared. The events of the day could be discussed. We often imagine prehistoric life as a constant struggle for survival, and certainly survival demanded tremendous effort. But people are people. Even in difficult circumstances, humans find opportunities for connection. They tell stories. They laugh. They teach. They share experiences. There is every reason to believe Neanderthals did many of the same things. Perhaps a successful hunt became the subject of discussion. Someone recounted a close encounter with a dangerous animal. Children listened with fascination while older members of the group described places they had visited or events they remembered. The details are lost to history. The human need for connection is not. One particularly interesting aspect of Neanderthal family life is that older individuals may have played a vital role within their communities. Physical strength matters enormously in a hunting society, but knowledge matters too. An elder who remembered migration routes, weather patterns, resource locations, and survival strategies possessed information that could benefit everyone. A person didn't need to chase animals across the landscape to contribute. Experience had value. Memory had value. Wisdom had value. And in a world without written records, every experienced individual represented a living library. The camp therefore became a place where generations interacted constantly. Children learned from adults. Adults learned from elders. Knowledge flowed through the community like a river moving through a valley. Outside, meanwhile, the world remained as challenging as ever. Winter winds swept across the plains. Predators moved through the darkness. Snow accumulated beyond the shelter. The cold waited patiently outside. But within the camp there was something stronger than any storm. There was cooperation. There was trust. There was family. And perhaps that is one of the most remarkable things about Neanderthal life. For all the attention given to their powerful bodies, their hunting abilities, and their adaptations to the Ice Age, their greatest strength may have been something much simpler. They had each other. Because in a world filled with uncertainty, danger, and relentless cold, survival wasn't just about finding food or building shelters. It was about creating a community capable of enduring those challenges together. Night after night. Winter after winter. Generation after generation. Families gathered around the same fires, shared the same warmth, taught the same lessons, and passed forward the knowledge that allowed their people to thrive in one of the harshest environments humanity has ever called home. If surviving the Ice Age was difficult for a fully grown Neanderthal, imagine experiencing it as a child. Imagine opening your eyes each morning in a world where winter seemed endless, where enormous animals wandered the landscape, where predators moved through the darkness beyond the camp, and where almost everything you needed to know about survival had to be learned through experience. Childhood in Neanderthal Europe was not sheltered from danger. It existed alongside it. From the very beginning, young Neanderthals entered a world that demanded attention. There were no child-proof homes. No fenced playgrounds. No emergency services waiting a phone call away. The landscape itself was filled with hazards. Rivers could be dangerous. Cliffs could be dangerous. Weather could be dangerous. Animals could be dangerous. Even the simple act of wandering too far from camp carried risks that modern children rarely encounter. And yet children grew up here. Generation after generation. For hundreds of thousands of years. Which tells us something important. Neanderthal parents were clearly doing something right. Like parents everywhere, they faced a challenge that never really changes throughout human history. They needed to protect their children while also preparing them for adulthood. Protecting a child forever wasn't possible. Eventually that child needed to learn how to navigate the world independently. The difference was that in Neanderthal Europe, the lessons often carried much greater consequences. A modern child might learn responsibility by feeding a pet. A young Neanderthal might learn responsibility by helping gather resources that contributed directly to the survival of the group. The stakes were different. The education was different. But the goal remained remarkably familiar. Prepare the next generation. Imagine a small child sitting near the fire while adults work around the camp. At first their world is relatively small. The shelter. The people they know. The warmth of the fire. Familiar faces. Familiar voices. Parents and relatives constantly nearby. The camp itself acts as a protective bubble against the larger dangers of the landscape. But children are curious. Human beings have always been curious. Sooner or later every child wants to know what exists beyond the immediate edge of safety. They watch older children. They watch adults. They notice hunting equipment. They notice animal tracks. They notice distant hills and forests. The world invites exploration. Parents therefore faced a balancing act that would feel familiar to many people today. Too much freedom could be dangerous. Too little freedom prevented learning. Somewhere between those extremes existed the path toward raising a capable adult. Young children likely remained close to camp for much of their early lives. Here they could observe daily activities while remaining under the watchful eyes of family members. Learning happened constantly, even when nobody intended to teach a formal lesson. A child watching an adult scrape an animal hide learned something. A child observing a spear being repaired learned something. A child listening to conversations around the fire learned something. Knowledge surrounded them at all times. There was no distinction between education and daily life because daily life was education. As children grew older, responsibilities gradually increased. Small tasks appeared first. Gathering nearby materials. Helping carry useful items. Assisting with simple camp activities. Nothing too demanding at first. Just enough to begin building confidence and competence. Over time those responsibilities expanded. Children accompanied adults on longer journeys. They learned where water could be found. They learned how to identify useful plants. They learned how to recognize animal tracks. They learned which areas of the landscape required caution. Every lesson improved their chances of surviving adulthood. The environment itself became a teacher. A cold morning taught preparation. A difficult journey taught endurance. A successful hunt taught cooperation. A mistake taught caution. The Ice Age provided feedback immediately and often. Of course, not every lesson was pleasant. Life in Neanderthal Europe involved genuine risks, and children were not completely protected from them. Illness existed. Injuries happened. Accidents occurred. Harsh weather created constant challenges. The loss of a family member was likely a reality many children experienced at some point during their lives. These hardships shaped communities in profound ways. They encouraged cooperation. They reinforced the importance of family. They emphasized the value of knowledge. When survival is difficult, experience becomes precious. That may help explain why children likely spent so much time observing older members of the group. Every elder represented a source of information accumulated over decades. Every experienced hunter carried lessons earned through years of trial and error. Every parent possessed practical knowledge that could help a child avoid danger. The transfer of that knowledge was one of the most important activities in the entire camp. Without it, the community could not continue. And communities clearly did continue. Neanderthal children didn't merely survive. Many of them eventually became skilled hunters, capable gatherers, knowledgeable parents, and respected members of their groups. The process took years, but it worked remarkably well. Imagine a child gradually growing into adulthood within one of these camps. The fire that once seemed enormous becomes familiar. The stories once listened to become stories they tell themselves. The lessons once received become lessons they pass on. The adults they once followed become peers. And eventually they become parents raising children of their own. The cycle continues. Season after season. Generation after generation. Throughout all of this, family remained the foundation of childhood. Parents protected children. Relatives assisted with care. Older siblings likely helped younger ones. The entire group shared responsibility for the next generation because every child represented the future of the community. In many ways, raising children during the Ice Age demanded extraordinary optimism. Think about it. Every lesson taught to a child was an investment in the future. Every skill passed forward assumed there would be another generation ready to receive it. Every act of care represented faith that the community would continue. And continue it did. Despite the cold. The predators. The uncertainty. All the challenges the Ice Age could present. Children laughed. Learned. grew up. Around fires, inside shelters, beneath winter skies and summer sunlight, the next generation slowly prepared itself to inherit the same demanding world that had shaped their parents and grandparents before them. Because in the end, the greatest achievement of the Neanderthals was not merely surviving dangerous conditions. It was raising children capable of surviving them too. By the time a young Neanderthal reached adulthood, one lesson had already been reinforced thousands of times. The world did not provide food simply because you were hungry. Every meal had to be earned. Every mouth in the camp depended on the ability of the group to find, gather, hunt, and secure resources from an environment that rarely gave anything away for free. Survival wasn't an occasional challenge that appeared during difficult times. It was the central activity around which life revolved. Each morning began with the same fundamental question. Where will today's food come from? Modern people often answer that question by walking to a refrigerator. Neanderthals answered it by studying the landscape, reading animal movements, observing seasonal changes, and relying on generations of accumulated knowledge. Before a single step was taken, before a single spear was lifted, the process of survival was already underway. The camp slowly came to life as the first light spread across the horizon. Embers from the night's fire were encouraged back into flame. People emerged from shelters wrapped in animal hides. Cold air filled their lungs. Frost clung to the ground. Somewhere beyond the camp, countless animals were already moving through the landscape, following patterns that had repeated for generations. Finding those animals was never guaranteed. The Ice Age world was vast. A herd that occupied one valley yesterday might be miles away today. A familiar migration route could suddenly change. Weather could alter movement patterns. Predators competed for the same resources. Nothing about obtaining food was simple. And yet, remarkably, Neanderthals became exceptionally skilled at it. The reason was straightforward. Their survival depended on understanding the world around them with extraordinary detail. A modern person might glance across a field and see grass. A Neanderthal hunter might see evidence of recent animal movement, signs of weather changes, clues about water availability, and indications of where food could potentially be found. The landscape spoke constantly. Successful people learned how to listen. Some mornings focused on hunting. Other mornings focused on gathering. Many days involved both. Large animals provided enormous rewards when hunts succeeded. A single large prey animal could supply food for numerous people. But hunting required preparation, coordination, and considerable risk. It wasn't something done carelessly. Gathering, meanwhile, provided another important source of resources. Plants, nuts, roots, berries, and edible vegetation contributed to survival in ways that are sometimes overlooked. The image of prehistoric hunters charging dramatically across the landscape captures attention, but gathering food often provided a more consistent return for the energy invested. Both activities mattered. Both required skill. Both demanded knowledge. And both began long before food actually appeared. Imagine standing near the edge of camp shortly after sunrise. Hunters are discussing the movements of animals observed during previous days. Others are preparing for journeys into nearby areas where useful plants might be found. Children watch from nearby, absorbing information without realizing how valuable it will eventually become. The air remains cold. The landscape stretches endlessly beyond the camp. Every decision matters. Which direction should be explored? How far should people travel? What resources are most urgently needed? Where were animals last seen? What weather conditions might develop later in the day? These questions shape everything that follows. Unlike modern occupations, survival offered no guaranteed paycheck for effort. A person could work incredibly hard and still return home empty-handed. Nature didn't reward determination simply because determination existed. Success required planning, adaptability, and occasionally a bit of luck. That uncertainty influenced the entire community. Food wasn't merely something people consumed. It was something people thought about constantly. When resources were abundant, life became easier. When resources became scarce, every decision gained additional importance. A successful group learned how to balance immediate needs against future requirements. Consuming everything at once created problems later. Preserving resources improved long-term survival. Sharing information improved efficiency. Cooperation increased the odds of success. Over thousands of years, Neanderthals developed systems that allowed them to thrive in environments that often appear hostile even to modern observers. They learned animal behavior. They learned seasonal patterns. They learned where resources could be found during different times of the year. This knowledge became one of their greatest strengths. A hunter who understood migration routes possessed an advantage. A gatherer who knew where edible plants grew possessed an advantage. A community capable of combining those skills possessed an even greater advantage. And perhaps that is one of the most remarkable aspects of Neanderthal survival. It wasn't based on brute force alone. Popular imagination often portrays them as immensely powerful individuals relying entirely on strength, but strength by itself doesn't keep a community alive for hundreds of thousands of years. Knowledge does. Observation does. Cooperation does. Every successful hunt reflected planning. Every gathering expedition reflected experience. Every meal represented countless decisions made correctly. The further you look into Neanderthal life, the more obvious it becomes that survival was not a single activity. It was an entire way of thinking. The weather was evaluated. The landscape was interpreted. Animal behavior was analyzed. Resources were monitored. Knowledge was shared. Lessons were remembered. Every day involved dozens of small choices, each contributing to the larger goal of keeping the group alive and healthy. And nowhere was that more evident than when hunters prepared themselves to leave the relative safety of camp and venture into a world where a single mistake could transform a routine hunt into a fight for survival. Because while hunting offered some of the greatest rewards available to a Neanderthal community, it also carried some of the greatest dangers. Before a hunt ever began, before a single spear was lifted or a single track was followed, there was preparation. A successful hunt wasn't the result of a lucky throw or a sudden burst of courage. It was the result of planning. Lots of planning. Because out in the Ice Age wilderness, mistakes had consequences that modern people rarely experience. Forget a piece of equipment today and you might have an annoying afternoon. Forget something important during a Neanderthal hunt and you might not come home at all. The day often started long before the hunters actually left camp. While the morning air still carried the cold of the night and the sun sat low above the horizon, people were already thinking about the landscape beyond the shelters. Somewhere out there were animals. Somewhere out there were opportunities. Somewhere out there was food that could sustain the entire community. The challenge was finding it and bringing it home without becoming food yourself. The first task was information. Good hunters paid attention. They remembered where animals had been seen. They remembered weather conditions. They remembered migration routes. They remembered water sources. The landscape was enormous, and wandering randomly across it hoping to encounter a mammoth was not an effective survival strategy. Knowledge saved energy. Knowledge saved time. Sometimes knowledge saved lives. Imagine a group gathered near the edge of camp shortly after sunrise. The fire is still burning behind them. Frost covers patches of ground. Breath hangs visibly in the cold air. Nobody is rushing. There is no dramatic speech. No heroic music. Just experienced people quietly discussing what they know. A herd of reindeer was spotted 2 days ago near a river crossing. Fresh tracks were discovered yesterday. The wind is coming from the north. Snowfall during the night may have covered older signs. Every detail matters. The hunt begins with observation long before it begins with movement. Weapons are inspected carefully. A damaged spear is not something you want to discover while standing 20 yards away from an angry animal weighing several thousand pounds. Stone points are checked for cracks. Wooden shafts are examined for weaknesses. Bindings are tightened. Anything suspicious is repaired immediately. These tools represent countless hours of work. Nobody treats them carelessly. A hunter's equipment is the result of knowledge accumulated over generations. Every improvement exists because someone learned a lesson, often the hard way. Over time those lessons become tradition. Certain methods work. Others don't. The people preparing for a hunt carry all of that accumulated experience with them. Then comes the matter of choosing who actually goes. Not everyone leaves camp. That would be a terrible idea. The camp still requires protection. Fires need maintenance. Children need supervision. Resources need processing. Hunting parties are carefully balanced because every member serves a purpose. Experience matters. Physical ability matters. Knowledge matters. A young hunter may have strength and enthusiasm. An older hunter may possess years of experience. Ideally, you want both. One provides energy. The other provides wisdom. Together they increase the chances of success. As preparations continue, animal hides are adjusted against the cold. Equipment is gathered. Small details receive attention because small details have a habit of becoming important later. The people involved understand this instinctively. Their survival depends upon it. And survival is never guaranteed. This is something easy to forget when looking back at prehistoric life from a comfortable distance. We know the hunt happened. We know people survived. Otherwise there would be no story to tell. But the individuals involved did not possess that certainty. Every hunting expedition carried risk. A hunter leaving camp could not know exactly what the day would bring. Perhaps animals would be found quickly. Perhaps the landscape would remain frustratingly empty. Perhaps weather conditions would deteriorate. Perhaps a predator would appear. Perhaps someone would get injured. The possibilities are endless. And yet people go anyway. Because staying behind carries its own risks. Food does not magically appear. The community depends upon action. The farther hunters move from camp, the more the world begins to change. Familiar sounds fade behind them. The warmth of the fire becomes a memory. Open terrain stretches ahead. Every ridge, valley, and patch of forest conceals information waiting to be discovered. Now the real work begins. Eyes scan the ground constantly. Tracks. Broken branches. Disturbed vegetation. Anything unusual. A successful hunter learns to notice details most people would miss entirely. A footprint pressed into soft soil. A patch of trampled grass. A cluster of droppings. To an untrained observer these things might appear insignificant. To a Neanderthal hunter they tell stories. An animal passed here. Not long ago. Moving in that direction. Perhaps alone. Perhaps with a herd. Suddenly the landscape becomes readable. The hunters aren't simply walking through the environment. They're interpreting it. Every sign adds another piece to the puzzle. Hours may pass this way. The pace is patient. Deliberate. There is no reason to rush. Animals have lived their entire lives avoiding predators. Careless movement often means failure. Success belongs to those willing to observe, think, and wait. Meanwhile the weather remains an ever-present concern. Clouds gather. Winds shift. Temperatures fluctuate. A clear morning can become an unpleasant afternoon with surprising speed. Hunters must constantly evaluate conditions because nature is participating in the hunt whether anyone wants it to or not. And then eventually, perhaps after hours of searching, someone notices something. Movement. Far in the distance. A dark shape against the landscape. Then another. And another. The hunt suddenly becomes real. All the preparation, the planning, the careful observation. Everything has been leading to this moment. The hunters slow their pace. Voices become quieter. Attention sharpens. Somewhere ahead stands an animal capable of feeding the entire camp. But it is also an animal capable of fighting back. And that is why preparation mattered so much. Because once the hunt truly begins, there is very little room left for mistakes. Once the animals had finally been located, the hunt entered an entirely different phase. Finding prey was an achievement in itself, but it was only the beginning. Now came the difficult part. Closing the distance. Understanding the herd. Predicting movement. Making decisions that could mean the difference between returning home with enough food to feed dozens of people or returning home exhausted, hungry, and empty-handed. The first thing hunters needed to do was slow down. A mammoth might be enormous, but that didn't make it easy to hunt. If anything, its size made the challenge even greater. Mammoths had survived for thousands of generations because they were remarkably good at staying alive. They moved across the landscape constantly, following seasonal routes that often stretched for enormous distances. A herd might be visible one day and gone the next. A successful hunter couldn't simply see a mammoth. They needed to understand where it had been, where it was going, and where it might be tomorrow. That understanding started with tracks. The ground was full of information for those who knew how to read it. Massive circular impressions pressed deep into soft earth revealed the passage of mammoths. Broken vegetation showed where they had fed. Mud disturbed near rivers indicated recent activity. Entire pathways sometimes appeared across the landscape, worn by generations of animals following familiar migration routes. To a modern observer, these signs might appear random. To a Neanderthal hunter, they formed a story. A story written across the land itself. The size of the track suggested the size of the animal. The depth revealed something about the ground conditions. The freshness indicated how recently the herd had passed through. Even subtle details mattered. A sharp edge around a footprint suggested recent movement. A footprint softened by wind or rain suggested age. Every clue added another piece to the puzzle. Tracking reindeer required a different approach. Unlike mammoths, reindeer moved in large, highly mobile herds. Their migrations could involve hundreds or even thousands of animals crossing vast regions. During certain seasons the landscape itself seemed to come alive with movement as herds traveled between feeding grounds. For hunters, this offered both opportunity and challenge. Large numbers of animals meant abundant food if a hunt succeeded. It also meant a great many eyes, ears, and noses capable of detecting danger. Reindeer were constantly alert. They had to be. Predators followed them wherever they went. Wolves watched them. Lions watched them. Humans watched them. An animal that failed to pay attention rarely survived for long. This meant hunters needed patience. Hours could pass while observing a herd from a distance. The direction of movement was studied. The behavior of individual animals was noted. Weak members were identified. Young animals were identified. Natural bottlenecks in the terrain were identified. Nothing happened quickly. Everything depended on understanding the herd before acting. Then there were bison. And bison presented their own unique challenges. If mammoths were enormous and reindeer were cautious, bison were powerful. Very powerful. A fully grown Ice Age bison was not the sort of animal anyone wanted charging directly toward them. These creatures possessed tremendous strength, thick muscles, and an impressive ability to become extremely unpleasant when threatened. Tracking them often meant following signs left behind across grasslands and valleys. Hoofprints marked the ground. Grazing areas revealed recent feeding activity. Disturbed soil indicated where animals had rested or moved through an area. But perhaps the most important thing hunters learned about bison was that they behaved differently from other prey. A frightened reindeer might flee. A mammoth might attempt to move away from danger. A bison sometimes responded by confronting the problem directly. And if you happened to be the problem, that was unfortunate news. This is why tracking wasn't simply about finding animals. It was about understanding them. Every species behaved differently. Every herd moved differently. Every landscape created different opportunities and different dangers. The best hunters weren't necessarily the strongest. They were often the most observant. They noticed things. Small things. Important things. The slight bend of grass. Fresh mud clinging to a footprint. A broken branch. A patch of disturbed snow. The Ice Age landscape constantly provided information, but only to those willing to pay attention. Hours passed this way. Sometimes entire days. The hunters moved quietly through forests, across river valleys, and over open plains. The world around them never stood still. Wind shifted direction. Clouds gathered overhead. Animals changed course. Every decision required adjustment. Yet this constant uncertainty was something Neanderthals understood remarkably well. They had grown up in it. As children they watched experienced hunters examine tracks. As adolescents they learned how to identify signs for themselves. As adults they carried that knowledge forward. Generation after generation. The landscape became a living textbook. And eventually, after enough observation, enough patience, and enough careful movement, the distance between hunter and prey began to shrink. The tracks became fresher. The signs became clearer. The evidence became impossible to ignore. The herd was close. Very close. Perhaps just beyond the next ridge. Perhaps hidden within a nearby valley. Perhaps feeding quietly out of sight. Heartbeats quickened. Attention sharpened. Every sense focused on the task ahead. Because now the hunt was no longer about finding animals. The animals had already been found. Now came the dangerous part. Now came the moment when a hunter had to step from observation into action. And in the world of the Neanderthals, that was often the moment when everything could go either wonderfully right or catastrophically wrong. The moment the hunters finally closed the distance and laid eyes on the animals, everything changed. Up until now, the hunt had been a test of patience, observation, and knowledge. From this point forward, it became a test of courage. Because no matter how carefully a hunt was planned, no matter how much experience the hunters possessed, there was one fact that could never be ignored. The animals were dangerous. Very dangerous. Modern people often encounter large animals from a comfortable distance. A wildlife documentary. A zoo enclosure. A photograph taken by someone standing safely far away. Those experiences can create the impression that large animals are simply oversized versions of familiar creatures. They are not. A mammoth was not a large elephant. A bison was not a slightly bigger cow. A wild Ice Age animal was a living force of nature, perfectly adapted to surviving in an unforgiving world. It possessed strength, speed, instincts, and experience that could turn a successful hunt into a disaster within seconds. Imagine standing on an open plain while a mammoth grazes several hundred feet away. At first glance the animal appears almost peaceful. It moves slowly. It feeds calmly. It seems completely unconcerned by the world around it. Then you remember what you're actually looking at. A creature weighing several tons. Muscles hidden beneath thick layers of fur. Massive curved tusks longer than many people were tall. Legs capable of carrying an enormous body across difficult terrain. Suddenly the situation feels very different. The hunters understand that one mistake could have consequences that cannot be undone. A mammoth does not need to be angry to be dangerous. It only needs to move unexpectedly. This reality followed Neanderthal hunters every time they left camp. There were no safe hunts. There were only hunts that happened to end well. Every approach required careful judgment. Every decision carried consequences. Move too quickly and the herd might scatter. Move too slowly and the opportunity might disappear. Approach from the wrong direction and the wind could betray your presence. Fail to notice an obstacle beneath your feet and you might stumble at exactly the wrong moment. The landscape itself seemed determined to participate in the danger. Snow concealed uneven ground. Ice transformed ordinary surfaces into hazards. Rocky slopes challenged every step. Rivers blocked movement. Dense vegetation reduced visibility. A hunter was not simply confronting an animal. They were confronting an entire environment filled with opportunities for things to go wrong. And things often did go wrong. The evidence remains visible even today within Neanderthal skeletons discovered by archaeologists. Broken ribs. Fractured arms. Damaged legs. Injuries that healed over time. Injuries that resemble those suffered by modern rodeo riders and people who work closely with large animals. These weren't occasional accidents. They appear so frequently that they seem almost woven into the fabric of Neanderthal life. A successful hunter likely carried scars. Old injuries. Stories hidden beneath layers of experience. Proof that survival had never been easy. Imagine a group preparing to confront a herd of bison. The animals appear calm for now, grazing across open ground beneath a gray ice age sky. Everything seems manageable. Then something changes. Perhaps a sudden movement catches the attention of one animal. Perhaps the wind shifts unexpectedly. Perhaps a bird takes flight and startles the herd. Within seconds the entire atmosphere transforms. Heads rise. Muscles tense. Animals begin moving. The calm disappears. Now hundreds of pounds of muscle and bone are reacting to uncertainty. And uncertainty can become panic. A frightened herd does not stop to consider your plans. A frightened herd moves. Fast. Very fast. Suddenly hunters must react to circumstances they cannot completely control. Dust fills the air. Snow scatters beneath pounding hooves. Visibility decreases. Noise increases. Every heartbeat seems louder than the last. This is why cooperation mattered so much. No individual hunter wanted to face these situations alone. Extra eyes improved awareness. Extra experience improved decision-making. Extra people increased the chances that everyone would return home safely. A lone hunter facing a charging animal confronted terrifying odds. A coordinated group stood a much better chance. Yet even groups could not eliminate danger entirely. The hunt always contained an element of uncertainty. The animal gets a vote. Nature gets a vote. Chance gets a vote. And none of them are particularly interested in making your life easier. Predators added another layer of complexity. Hunters were not the only creatures pursuing large herbivores across the Ice Age landscape. Wolves tracked herds. Cave lions tracked herds. Hyenas tracked herds. Sometimes Neanderthals found themselves competing against animals that were every bit as skilled at hunting as they were. Imagine successfully locating a promising group of reindeer after hours of tracking. Excitement grows. The opportunity looks perfect. Then fresh wolf tracks appear nearby. Suddenly a new question emerges. How close are the wolves? No one wants to discover the answer unexpectedly. The Ice Age wilderness was crowded with competitors. Food attracted attention. Hunters attracted attention. Opportunities attracted attention. A successful hunt could easily become more complicated than anyone anticipated. Even after an animal was brought down, danger remained. A wounded animal is often more dangerous than a healthy one. Pain creates unpredictability. Fear creates unpredictability. A cornered creature fighting for survival becomes capable of extraordinary resistance. This meant the final moments of a hunt were often among the most dangerous. Distance closed. Adrenaline surged. Decisions accelerated. Every movement mattered. The hunters knew exactly what was at stake. Their families needed food. Their community depended upon success. Yet nobody could ignore the possibility that someone might not return. That reality may sound grim to modern ears, but it also highlights something remarkable about the Neanderthals. They hunted anyway. Day after day. Season after season. Year after year. Not because they enjoyed danger for its own sake, but because survival demanded it. The camp needed food. Children needed food. Elders needed food. Winter needed to be endured. So the hunters prepared themselves, stepped into the landscape, and accepted risks that most modern people would find difficult to imagine. They relied on skill. They relied on experience. They relied on one another. And when they eventually returned to camp carrying the rewards of a successful hunt, everyone understood exactly what that success had cost. It had required patience, knowledge, courage, and a willingness to face some of the largest and most dangerous animals on Earth. Because in the world of the Neanderthals, every hunt carried the possibility of failure, every hunt carried the possibility of injury, and every hunt carried the possibility of death. That was simply the price of survival in Ice Age Europe. After a successful hunt, it was easy to admire the courage of the hunters. It was easy to focus on the mammoth brought down or the bison carried back to camp. But behind every successful hunt stood something equally important. Tools. Because strength alone was never enough. A Neanderthal could be powerful, experienced, and determined, but without the right equipment, survival became dramatically more difficult. In many ways, the story of the Neanderthals is also the story of the tools they carried in their hands every single day. The popular image of prehistoric tools often involves crude rocks being smashed together until something vaguely sharp appears. While that image contains a tiny grain of truth, it misses something important. Neanderthal tools were not random objects. They were carefully designed solutions to specific problems. Every edge, every point, every shape existed for a reason. These weren't the inventions of people stumbling through life by guesswork. They were the products of generations of observation, experimentation, and practical knowledge. Imagine sitting near a fire on a cold evening while an experienced toolmaker works nearby. In front of them rests a collection of stone cores gathered from the landscape. To an untrained eye they look ordinary. Just rocks. Nothing special. But to someone who understands the craft, each stone contains possibilities waiting to be released. The process begins with careful selection. Not every rock is suitable. Some break unpredictably. Some are too soft. Some refuse to produce sharp edges. Finding good stone requires knowledge. Finding excellent stone requires experience. Neanderthals often sought specific materials because they understood exactly how those materials behaved. Flint was particularly valuable. When struck correctly, it fractured in predictable ways, producing razor-sharp edges. Even today, freshly broken flint is astonishingly sharp. A person handling it carelessly can discover this fact very quickly and often quite painfully. Once suitable stone was found, the real work began. A controlled strike. A sharp crack. A fragment separates from the core. Another strike follows. Then another. Slowly the shape begins to emerge. Piece by piece. Flake by flake. What started as an ordinary stone transforms into something useful. A scraper. A cutting tool. A spear point. A knife. The process requires skill because every strike matters. Hit the stone too hard and valuable material may shatter. Hit it too softly and nothing useful happens. Choose the wrong angle and the desired shape never appears. Toolmaking was not simply physical labor. It was a form of problem solving. And good tools changed everything. A sharp stone blade could process animal hides more efficiently. A well-made scraper could prepare materials for clothing. A cutting edge could butcher large animals far more effectively than bare hands. Tasks that would otherwise consume enormous amounts of time became faster and easier. In a survival-based society, that efficiency mattered. Time saved in one activity could be invested elsewhere. More food could be processed. More hides could be prepared. More resources could be gathered. Small improvements accumulated into major advantages. Among the most important tools available to Neanderthal hunters were their spears. Unlike the dramatic throwing spears often shown in movies, many Neanderthal spears were likely designed primarily for close-range hunting. This fact alone should inspire a certain level of respect. Closing the distance between yourself and a large Ice Age animal requires confidence bordering on recklessness. Imagine gripping a wooden spear while standing within range of a creature capable of crushing bones with a single movement. The spear becomes far more than a weapon. It becomes the thin line separating hunter and disaster. Wood formed the backbone of these weapons. Carefully selected branches or young tree trunks were shaped and hardened. Stone points could be attached to improve effectiveness. Binding materials secured components together. Every part served a purpose. The finished result looked simple. Simple did not mean ineffective. Some of humanity's most successful technologies appear deceptively uncomplicated. The spear belonged firmly in that category. A properly constructed spear extended the hunter's reach. It increased safety. It concentrated force. It transformed physical ability into something far more useful. For countless generations, it remained one of the most important pieces of equipment a Neanderthal could possess. Yet hunting tools represented only a portion of their technological world. Daily life required many different solutions. Scrapers were especially important. Animal hides did not prepare themselves. Fresh skins required extensive work before becoming useful clothing or shelter coverings. Fat, tissue, and unwanted material needed removal. Scrapers performed this task efficiently. Archaeologists have discovered large numbers of these tools at Neanderthal sites, suggesting they played a major role in everyday life. Then there were cutting tools. Sharp flakes. Stone knives. Multi-purpose implements. These tools accompanied people through countless activities. Food preparation. Tool maintenance. Resource processing. The list seemed endless. A Neanderthal camp was not a place filled with one or two basic objects. It was a working environment supported by an entire toolkit. Every item earned its place. Every item solved a problem. And every item reflected knowledge passed down through generations. Perhaps one of the most remarkable things about Neanderthal technology is how adaptable it was. Different environments required different solutions. Available resources varied from region to region. Conditions changed. Needs changed. The tools changed accordingly. People experimented. People improved. People learned. When a particular design worked well, it spread. When a particular method failed, it disappeared. Over thousands of years this process produced a sophisticated understanding of materials and craftsmanship. The results may appear humble compared to modern technology, but appearances can be misleading. A smartphone cannot help much if you're trying to survive an Ice Age winter. A sharp scraper can. A spear can. A cutting tool can. Technology should always be judged by how effectively it solves the problems people actually face. By that standard, Neanderthal tools were extraordinarily successful. The evidence for this success exists everywhere archaeologists look. Stone tools appear across enormous geographic regions. Similar techniques emerge repeatedly. Certain designs persist for astonishing lengths of time. None of this happens by accident. It reflects generations of people refining their understanding of what works. Imagine an experienced elder sitting near the fire, demonstrating toolmaking to younger members of the group. Stone strikes stone. Small flakes scatter across the ground. A rough shape gradually becomes refined. The lesson is not delivered through a formal lecture. It happens through observation. Through repetition. Through practice. The younger generation watches carefully. One day they will need these skills themselves. One day their survival may depend upon them. And so the knowledge continues forward. From parent to child. From teacher to student. From one generation to the next. Outside the shelter, winter winds move across the landscape. Herds continue their migrations. Predators continue their hunts. The challenges of Ice Age life remain unchanged. Inside the camp, however, human ingenuity is at work. A spear is repaired. A scraper is sharpened. A new tool begins to take shape from a carefully chosen piece of stone. Small actions. Simple tools. But together they allow a species to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Because the Neanderthals did not survive through strength alone. They survived through intelligence, adaptability, and an extraordinary ability to transform ordinary materials into the tools that made survival possible. While hunting often captures most of the attention, it was only one part of the survival equation. A successful mammoth hunt might provide enough food for an entire community, but mammoths did not politely appear whenever people happened to be hungry. Some hunts failed. Some animals migrated elsewhere. Some days the landscape simply refused to cooperate. That is why gathering plants, nuts, berries, roots, and other edible resources remained an important part of Neanderthal life. Survival depended on flexibility, and flexible people rarely rely upon a single source of food. As the hunters disappeared into the distance carrying spears and equipment, other members of the community often focused on a different task. Instead of tracking large animals across open plains, they turned their attention toward the countless smaller resources scattered throughout the landscape. To an untrained observer, the Ice Age environment might appear empty. Vast grasslands. Forests, rivers. Hills. Cold winds moving endlessly across the terrain. But to someone who understood the land, it was filled with opportunities. The trick was knowing where to look. Knowledge mattered just as much during gathering as it did during hunting. Not every plant could be eaten. Some provided valuable nutrition. Others offered very little benefit. A few could even be dangerous. Generations of observation helped Neanderthal communities distinguish between useful resources and mistakes best avoided. Imagine a small group leaving camp shortly after sunrise. The morning air remains cool. Frost lingers in shaded areas. The fire gradually disappears behind them as they move into the surrounding landscape. Their pace is different from that of hunters. There is no need to track large prey. No need to move toward distant herds. Instead, attention focuses on the ground, the trees, and the vegetation growing throughout the environment. Every season brings different possibilities. Spring transforms the landscape. New growth appears. Tender shoots emerge from the soil. Fresh vegetation becomes available after the long hardships of winter. For people who have spent months enduring cold conditions and limited resources, these changes are significant. The land is becoming productive once again. Summer expands those opportunities even further. Plants grow larger. Berries begin to ripen. Vegetation becomes more abundant. Rivers and wetlands support a variety of edible resources. The landscape feels alive. Everywhere there is evidence of growth. And everywhere there is food for those who know how to find it. A person experienced in gathering develops a remarkable awareness of their surroundings. They notice details that others might overlook completely. A particular patch of vegetation. A certain type of tree. A familiar hillside where edible plants reliably appear year after year. The landscape becomes a map. Not a map drawn on parchment. A map stored in memory. One generation learns it from the previous generation. Then passes it forward. Again and again. across thousands of years. Nuts were especially valuable when available. They were rich in energy and could often be stored for later use. Finding a productive area containing nut-bearing trees was like discovering a prehistoric grocery store that nature had conveniently stocked in advance. Of course, nature expected payment in the form of effort. Nuts needed collecting, processing, and sometimes cracking open, but the nutritional reward justified the work. Berries offered another welcome source of food. Imagine walking through a relatively sheltered area during the warmer months and discovering clusters of ripe berries hanging among the vegetation. Bright colors stand out against the surrounding greenery. The fruit is easy to collect. Easy to eat. Sweetness appears in a world where sweetness is relatively uncommon. For modern people surrounded by processed foods, this may not sound particularly impressive. For a Neanderthal community, it was a welcome discovery. Food did not have to be large to be valuable. Sometimes the most useful resources were the easiest to overlook. Roots and underground plant parts also contributed to survival. While they may not inspire the same excitement as a mammoth hunt, they possessed one significant advantage. They couldn't run away. A root remained exactly where it was yesterday. And where it would probably remain tomorrow. This predictability mattered. Especially during difficult times. Especially when hunting results were uncertain. A reliable food source offered stability. The work of gathering often required patience rather than speed. People moved carefully through the landscape, examining familiar areas, collecting resources, and constantly evaluating conditions. Along the way they observed animal activity, weather patterns, and environmental changes. Gathering food wasn't simply about obtaining calories. It was another way of learning about the world. Every journey added information. Every season revealed new details. Every year strengthened understanding. Children likely participated in these activities as well. Gathering offered an excellent opportunity for learning because it required close observation of the environment. Young people learned which plants were useful. They learned when resources became available. They learned where to find them. Knowledge that might seem simple was actually incredibly important. After all, knowing where food exists is one of the most valuable skills any living creature can possess. As the day progressed, collected resources gradually accumulated. Small discoveries added together. A handful of berries here. Useful plants there. Nuts gathered from another location. Individually these finds might appear modest. Together they represented a meaningful contribution to the community. Eventually the journey turned back toward camp. The familiar shelters reappeared. Smoke rose from the fire. Voices carried through the air. People returned with the results of their efforts. Perhaps hunters had been successful. Perhaps they had not. Either way, the gathered resources helped strengthen the community's food supply. This balance between hunting and gathering reveals something important about Neanderthal survival. They were not simply big-game hunters obsessed with chasing enormous animals across the Ice Age landscape. They were practical people making use of every available opportunity. Large prey provided tremendous rewards, but smaller resources filled important gaps. Together these strategies created a more reliable system than either could provide alone. And perhaps that was one of the Neanderthals' greatest strengths. They adapted. They observed. They took advantage of what the environment offered. Whether that meant tracking a mammoth across frozen plains or collecting berries beneath the summer sun, the goal remained the same. Find food. Support the community. Survive another season. Because in the harsh world of Ice Age Europe, every resource mattered, no matter how large or how small. By the time people began returning to camp, the day's efforts were finally becoming visible. Hunters appeared on the horizon carrying equipment worn by hours of travel. Gatherers returned with plants, roots, nuts, and berries collected from across the landscape. The long process of finding food was ending, but another equally important process was just beginning. Because obtaining food was only half the challenge. Deciding what to do with it mattered just as much. Unlike many predators, Neanderthals did not simply eat wherever they happened to make a kill and then wander away. Food returned to the camp. Food returned to the community. Food returned to the people who depended on one another for survival. In many ways, this simple act of bringing resources back and sharing them may have been one of the foundations of Neanderthal society. Imagine the scene late in the afternoon. The sun hangs low above the horizon. Long shadows stretch across the frozen ground. The fire burns steadily at the center of camp. Children notice the returning hunters first. Excitement spreads quickly. People gather to see what has been brought back. Perhaps the hunt was successful. Perhaps a reindeer has been taken. Perhaps several smaller animals. Perhaps the hunters return with stories rather than meat. Whatever the outcome, everyone pays attention because everyone has a stake in the result. Food is never just food. Food is security. Food is warmth. Food is tomorrow. A successful hunt immediately creates work. Large animals must be processed. Meat needs to be cut. Useful materials need to be separated. Hides must be preserved. Bones may eventually become tools. Tendons may become cordage. Very little goes to waste because resources are simply too valuable. Stone tools appear. Sharp flakes slice through hide and muscle. Experienced hands move efficiently. This is work they have performed countless times before. The process is organized. Purposeful. Almost routine. Yet beneath that routine lies something remarkable. An enormous animal that only hours ago was moving freely across the landscape is now being transformed into the resources that will sustain an entire community. And that community shares in the rewards. One of the reasons cooperation proved so valuable in Neanderthal life was because hunting success could never be guaranteed. Some days produced excellent results. Other days produced disappointment. If every individual was expected to survive entirely on their own, periods of bad luck could become disastrous. Sharing reduced that risk. A successful hunter today might be unsuccessful tomorrow. A family with abundant resources this week might face difficulties next week. Cooperation created stability. The community became stronger than any individual member. As food was distributed, the camp gradually settled into one of the most important moments of the day. Evening. The temperature began falling. The sky slowly darkened. People moved closer to the fire. And preparations for the meal began. The fire had already served many purposes throughout the day. It provided warmth. It offered light. It acted as a gathering place. Now it became a kitchen. Cooking transformed food in ways that offered enormous advantages. Meat became easier to chew. Easier to digest. Safer to consume. Valuable nutrients became more accessible. A successful hunt became even more useful once fire entered the equation. Imagine strips of meat positioned near the flames. Fat drips onto hot coals with an occasional hiss. The scent of cooking food spreads through the camp. Smoke rises into the evening air. Shadows dance across shelter walls. After a long day of effort, the smell alone must have been deeply satisfying. For people living in the Ice Age, meals represented more than nutrition. They represented success. Proof that the day's work had accomplished something. Proof that another night could be faced with full stomachs rather than empty ones. Around the fire, the camp slowly transformed from a workplace into a social space. The intensity of the day faded. Tools were set aside. Tasks became less urgent. People gathered together. Children listened to conversations. Adults discussed events from the hunt. Experiences were shared. Knowledge was exchanged. The fire illuminated faces while darkness spread across the surrounding landscape. Outside the camp, predators continued their nightly activities. The wind moved through the grasslands. The cold steadily increased. But within the circle of firelight there was food, warmth, and company. The atmosphere must have felt entirely different from the challenges faced only hours earlier. A hunter who spent the day tracking animals across frozen terrain could finally rest. A gatherer who spent hours searching for useful plants could finally relax. Children who spent the day learning and exploring could settle near their families. Everyone came together. And food helped make that possible. Modern people often think of meals as ordinary parts of daily life. Breakfast. Lunch. Dinner. Something squeezed between other activities. In a Neanderthal camp, meals likely carried much greater significance. Every bite represented effort. Every meal represented cooperation. Every shared portion represented trust within the group. The fire crackled steadily. Meat roasted. Voices drifted through the shelter. The day gradually came to an end. And as darkness fully claimed the landscape beyond the camp, the community gathered around its most important resource. Not the hunt. Not the tools. Not even the food itself. Each other. Because in the harsh world of Ice Age Europe, survival depended on many things. Strong hunters. Useful tools. Warm shelters. Reliable fires. But perhaps most importantly, it depended on people willing to share what they had, gather around the same fire, and face the challenges of tomorrow together. By the time the fire was burning brightly and the evening meal was being prepared, most people in the camp were probably thinking about food in a very simple way. They were hungry. They wanted to eat. They wanted the rewards of a long day spent hunting, gathering, tracking, carrying, and surviving. But if a modern person could somehow sit beside that fire and examine what was actually being served, they might discover that the Neanderthal menu was far stranger than expected. The reason was simple. The Ice Age did not offer luxury. It offered opportunity. And Neanderthals became remarkably good at taking advantage of every opportunity they could find. The day's search for food often began before sunrise. While embers from the night's fire were being coaxed back to life, people were already thinking about resources. Hunters prepared their equipment. Gatherers planned their routes. The camp slowly awakened with a single goal in mind. Find food. Everything else came later. The hunters moved into the landscape first. Spears in hand, wrapped in animal skins, they disappeared beyond the edges of the camp and into a world of frost-covered grasslands, forests, valleys, and rivers. Somewhere out there were reindeer, bison, horses, mammoths, and countless other animals moving across the Ice Age landscape. The challenge was finding them. A successful hunter didn't simply look for animals. They looked for evidence. Tracks pressed into soft ground. Broken branches. Disturbed vegetation. Fresh droppings. Signs that something large had recently passed through the area. The land itself became a source of information. Hours might pass before anything significant appeared. Sometimes the hunters followed mammoth tracks stretching across enormous distances. Massive footprints pressed deeply into the earth revealed the movements of creatures so large that they seemed almost unreal. Other times reindeer became the focus. Their migrations could provide enormous quantities of food if approached correctly. Then there were bison, powerful animals capable of feeding an entire community but equally capable of causing serious injury. Success required patience, observation, experience, and occasionally a willingness to get far closer to a very large animal than most modern people would ever consider sensible. Meanwhile, back near the camp and throughout the surrounding landscape, gathering parties pursued an entirely different strategy. They searched not for enormous animals but for the smaller resources that often went unnoticed. Roots hidden beneath the soil. Edible plants growing near rivers. Nuts collected from trees. Berries appearing during warmer seasons. Mushrooms emerging under the right conditions. The Ice Age landscape could appear empty to an outsider, but people who understood it knew better. Food existed everywhere. You simply had to know where to find it. Knowledge passed through generations made this possible. Certain valleys produced useful plants. Certain forests provided seasonal resources. Certain areas became reliable gathering locations year after year. Children learned these places from parents. Parents learned them from elders. Knowledge accumulated over centuries. Every successful discovery added something to the camp's survival. A handful of berries. A collection of edible roots. A cache of nuts. Small resources perhaps. But valuable ones. Because survival rarely depended on one enormous success. More often it depended on many smaller successes added together. As the day continued, hunters and gatherers both contributed to a growing supply of food. Eventually people began returning to camp. Some carried meat. Others carried plants. Others returned with useful materials gathered during their travels. Now the transformation began. Large animals were processed carefully. Stone tools sliced through hide, muscle, and fat. Valuable resources were separated and preserved. Every part of an animal possessed potential value. And this is where the Neanderthal menu began to look unusual. Because Neanderthals didn't always focus on the same cuts of meat that modern people might choose. In fact, some of their favorite foods would probably surprise many people. Animal fat was incredibly important. Modern diets often treat fat as something to avoid. Ice Age survival encouraged the opposite perspective. Fat contained enormous amounts of energy. Energy meant warmth. Energy meant survival. During cold winters, fat became one of the most valuable resources available. Marrow was especially prized. Inside the bones of large animals existed nutrient-rich marrow that could be extracted and consumed. To modern eyes, smashing open a massive bone to reach its contents might seem unusual. To a Neanderthal, it was simply common sense. Why waste valuable nutrition? The answer was obvious. You wouldn't. Brains from hunted animals may also have been consumed. Rich in nutrients and fats, they represented another valuable food source. Again, modern diners might hesitate when reading the menu. Neanderthals likely did not. When obtaining food requires tremendous effort, preferences become less important than practicality. And practicality often won. Evidence also suggests that Neanderthals consumed a surprisingly varied range of plants. For years people imagined them as almost entirely dependent upon meat. More recent discoveries suggest a more complex reality. Different groups ate different foods depending on where they lived and what resources were available. Some consumed nuts. Some consumed roots. Some consumed berries. Some consumed mushrooms. Some even appear to have used medicinal plants. The result was a diet that adapted to local conditions rather than following a single rigid pattern. And adaptation was one of the Neanderthals' greatest strengths. As evening settled across the camp, these resources gradually became meals. Meat roasted over fires. Plant foods were prepared. Families gathered together. The smell of cooking food mixed with wood smoke drifting through the cold air. Outside the shelter, darkness spread across the landscape. Predators moved through the night. The temperature dropped. Winter continued its endless work. Inside the camp, however, there was warmth. There was food. There was community. A hunter who had spent hours tracking reindeer across frozen ground now sat beside the same fire as someone who had spent the day gathering roots and berries. Different tasks. Different skills. Same purpose. Keeping the group alive. And perhaps that is what makes the Neanderthal diet so fascinating. It wasn't strange because of the individual foods they ate. It was strange because of how completely it reflected their world. Every bite told a story about hunting dangerous animals, gathering seasonal resources, surviving harsh winters, and adapting to one of the most challenging environments humans have ever inhabited. Their meals were not designed for comfort. They were designed for survival. And for hundreds of thousands of years, they worked remarkably well. As the evening meal slowly disappeared and the fire settled into a steady rhythm of glowing embers and dancing flames, another part of Neanderthal life began to emerge. The day's hunting was over. The gathering was finished. Tools had been repaired. Food had been shared. Outside the shelter, darkness spread across the Ice Age landscape, covering valleys, forests, and frozen plains beneath a sky filled with stars. Inside the camp, however, people remained awake. And whenever human beings gather around a fire with time to spare, something interesting tends to happen. They talk. This raises a fascinating question. Did Neanderthals tell stories? The truth is that nobody can know for certain what words were spoken around a Neanderthal fire 80,000 years ago. No recordings exist. No written records survive. No ancient storyteller left behind a manuscript titled Tales from the Mammoth Hunt. Yet despite this absence of direct evidence, many researchers believe it would be surprising if they didn't tell stories. Because storytelling is one of the most natural things humans do. Long before books existed, stories existed. Long before writing existed, stories existed. Long before cities existed, stories existed. Stories are how people explain the world. Stories are how knowledge travels. Stories are how communities remember. And Neanderthals lived in communities that depended heavily upon memory. Imagine a cold winter evening deep within Ice Age Europe. Wind rattles against the shelter outside. Snow drifts across the landscape. The fire burns warmly at the center of the camp. Families sit nearby wrapped in animal hides. Children remain close to parents. The day's work has finally ended. What happens next? Nobody is hunting. Nobody is gathering. Nobody is traveling. For the first time all day, people have an opportunity to simply be together. Silence is possible. But human beings rarely remain silent for very long. Someone speaks. Perhaps they describe an event from the day's hunt. A close encounter with a bison. An unexpected animal track. A mistake that nearly ended badly. Others listen. Questions are asked. Details are added. The story grows. What begins as information gradually becomes entertainment. And entertainment gradually becomes tradition. This process happens naturally in human societies all over the world. There is little reason to think Neanderthals would be different. In fact, stories may have served important practical purposes. Imagine a young child sitting beside the fire listening to older members of the group describe dangerous situations they encountered years earlier. Perhaps someone tells the story of a hunter who ignored the wind and frightened away an entire herd. Perhaps someone describes a river crossing that became unexpectedly dangerous. Perhaps someone recounts an encounter with a cave bear. The child is entertained. But the child is also learning. Stories are efficient teachers. A lesson wrapped inside a memorable narrative often survives longer than a simple instruction. Be careful around rivers is useful advice. The river that nearly carried away your uncle during a spring flood is advice nobody forgets. Stories help knowledge survive. And knowledge was one of the most valuable resources a Neanderthal community possessed. Some stories may have focused on animals. After all, animals dominated much of daily life. Mammoths, reindeer, bison, horses, wolves, lions, and bears constantly shaped the experiences of Ice Age people. Children probably grew up hearing countless accounts involving these creatures. Successful hunts. Dangerous hunts. Unusual encounters. Strange observations. Animals provided an endless supply of material. But not every story needed to be practical. Human beings also enjoy stories simply because stories are enjoyable. A funny mistake. An embarrassing moment. A remarkable coincidence. An amusing misunderstanding. These kinds of stories appear in nearly every culture throughout history. There is something deeply human about sharing experiences and laughing together afterward. And Neanderthals were, in many ways, very human. The fire itself likely encouraged storytelling. Fire creates a unique environment. It gathers people together. It slows the pace of activity. It creates a natural focal point. Even today people often find themselves sharing stories around campfires. The setting seems to invite it. Now imagine that campfire is the center of your entire social world. No television, radio, internet, books. Just people. Voices. Memories. Experiences. The appeal of storytelling becomes obvious. Stories may also have helped strengthen group identity. Every community develops shared memories. Certain events become legendary. Certain individuals become memorable. Certain experiences are repeated and retold until everyone knows them. Perhaps a particularly successful hunter became famous within the group. Perhaps an elder remembered an extraordinary winter from decades earlier. Perhaps a remarkable mammoth hunt became a story told for years afterward. The details changed. The stories survived. This process creates social bonds. People feel connected through shared narratives. The community develops a collective memory. And collective memory helps communities endure. Even children likely participated. At first they listened. Then they repeated stories. Then eventually they told stories of their own. One generation passing experiences to the next. One firelit evening at a time. Of course, not every story would have involved danger or survival. Some may have explored curiosity about the natural world itself. The stars above. The changing seasons. The behavior of animals. Strange events nobody could explain. Humans naturally seek explanations. When answers are unavailable, stories often fill the gap. Perhaps Neanderthals wondered about thunderstorms, they wondered about death, they wondered about dreams. We cannot know their exact thoughts. But we do know they possessed large brains, complex social lives, and sophisticated behavior. Those qualities often create curiosity. And curiosity often creates stories. As the night deepened and the fire slowly burned lower, voices likely continued drifting through the shelter. Children fought sleep while trying to hear one more tale. Adults shared memories. Elders passed along knowledge gathered over decades of experience. Outside, the Ice Age world remained cold, dark, and unforgiving. Inside, however, something else existed. Conversation. Memory. Imagination. Perhaps even storytelling. And while we may never know the exact words spoken around those ancient fires, it is difficult to imagine generations of intelligent, social people gathering together night after night without eventually sharing stories. Because wherever humans gather, stories tend to follow. And the Neanderthals, despite living in a world of mammoths and glaciers, were likely no exception. As the stories continued around the fire and the long Ice Age night settled over the camp, another fascinating question begins to emerge. What did Neanderthals do when they weren't hunting, gathering, repairing tools, or preparing for survival? For a long time, people imagined them as creatures whose lives revolved entirely around practical necessities. Hunt. Eat. Sleep. Repeat. According to that old stereotype, creativity belonged to modern humans while Neanderthals spent their days looking serious and occasionally wrestling mammoths. The reality appears to have been far more interesting. The more archaeologists learn about Neanderthals, the more evidence emerges that they may have possessed a surprising creative side. They were not simply surviving the Ice Age. They were experiencing it. Observing it. Interacting with it. And perhaps even finding ways to express themselves within it. Imagine another evening inside the shelter. The fire burns steadily. Shadows dance across stone walls. Outside, the wind moves through the darkness. Inside, people gather together after a long day. Some are repairing tools. Some are preparing hides. Children sit nearby listening to conversations. The camp feels calm. It is in moments like these that creativity often appears. Human creativity rarely waits for perfect conditions. It emerges wherever people exist. Sometimes it appears in music. Sometimes in art. Sometimes in decoration. Sometimes in simple acts that serve no immediate survival purpose at all. And that is what makes creativity so fascinating. It often exists because people want it to exist. Not because they need it. One of the most intriguing discoveries connected to Neanderthals involves objects that appear to have been collected purely because they were interesting. Archaeologists have found unusual feathers, colorful minerals, eagle talons, shells, and other items that seem to have held value beyond practical usefulness. An eagle talon does not help hunt a mammoth. A colorful mineral does not keep you warm. A decorative feather does not sharpen a spear. Yet people collected them anyway. Why? Because something about them mattered. Perhaps they were beautiful. Perhaps they were symbolic. Perhaps they represented status. Perhaps they simply caught someone's attention. Whatever the reason, these discoveries suggest that Neanderthals sometimes looked at the world and appreciated things that were not strictly necessary for survival. That alone tells us something important. It tells us they were paying attention. Not just to danger. Not just to food. But to beauty as well. Then there is the question of art. The idea of Neanderthals creating art would have sounded absurd to many scholars a century ago. Today, however, evidence suggests the story may be more complicated. In several caves, researchers have discovered markings and pigments that may have been created by Neanderthals long before modern humans arrived in those regions. Imagine entering a cave illuminated only by flickering firelight. Deep inside, far from the entrance, someone applies pigment to a wall. Perhaps it is a simple shape. Perhaps a series of lines. Perhaps a handprint. We cannot know exactly what they intended. But intention itself is significant. Creating something for symbolic reasons requires thought. It requires imagination. It requires the ability to look beyond immediate survival. That is a remarkable thing for any species. Especially one living in the harsh conditions of Ice Age Europe. Music presents an even greater mystery. Did Neanderthals make music? Nobody knows for certain. But once again, the possibility is difficult to ignore. Music appears almost everywhere humans exist. Every culture develops some form of rhythm, song, or musical expression. It seems to be woven deeply into the human experience. Now imagine a group sitting around a fire after dark. The flames crackle. Wind moves outside the shelter. Someone taps a rhythm against a piece of wood. Someone else joins in. Voices rise and fall. Perhaps a simple melody emerges. Perhaps it is nothing more than humming. Perhaps it accompanies a story. Perhaps it accompanies a celebration after a successful hunt. The scene feels entirely plausible. After all, rhythm exists naturally in daily life. Footsteps create rhythm. Stone toolmaking creates rhythm. Work creates rhythm. Even the sounds of nature create rhythm. Humans have always been remarkably good at turning rhythm into music. And Neanderthals possessed ears, brains, emotions, and social lives that were in many ways similar to our own. It would be surprising if they never experimented with sound. Children likely played an important role in this creative world as well. Children are naturally curious. They collect unusual objects. They draw shapes in dirt. They imitate sounds. They invent games. These behaviors appear across cultures and throughout history. There is little reason to believe Neanderthal children were different. Imagine a child finding a brightly colored stone near a river. The stone serves no obvious purpose. Yet the child keeps it. Shows it to others. Carries it back to camp. That small act of curiosity may seem insignificant, but curiosity often forms the foundation of creativity. A desire to explore. A desire to experiment. A desire to understand. Those impulses help drive innovation. They help create culture. And they help transform survival into something richer. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is that creativity does not require civilization. It does not require cities, writing, or advanced technology. Creativity appears wherever intelligent social beings have opportunities to think beyond immediate needs. A decorative object. A painted symbol. A rhythmic sound. A story told around a fire. These things may not fill an empty stomach. But they nourish something else. Something equally human. As the night deepens and the camp grows quieter, the fire continues to illuminate faces gathered around it. Some people listen to stories. Some work with tools. Some simply enjoy the warmth. Somewhere nearby, a child examines an interesting object collected earlier that day. Someone hums softly. Someone traces a shape in the dirt. Outside, the ice age remains as cold and unforgiving as ever. Inside, however, another force is at work. Imagination. The ability to see meaning where none is required. The ability to create something that serves no purpose except expression. And whether through music, art, decoration, or simple curiosity, the evidence increasingly suggests that Neanderthals possessed that ability too. They were not merely surviving the world around them. They were experiencing it, interpreting it, and perhaps even finding beauty within it. And that may be one of the most fascinating things we have ever learned about our ancient cousins. Caring for the sick and elderly may not sound like the most dramatic part of Neanderthal life. There are no mammoth charges. No desperate hunts across frozen plains. No life-or-death confrontations with predators. Yet in many ways, it may be one of the most remarkable things we know about them. Because surviving the Ice Age was difficult enough for a healthy adult. Surviving it while injured, sick, or physically limited should have been nearly impossible. And yet, archaeological evidence suggests it happened repeatedly. The Ice Age was not a forgiving place. Every day demanded effort. Food had to be found. Fire had to be maintained. Shelters needed repair. Dangerous animals roamed the landscape. Winter temperatures could turn a simple mistake into a deadly one. In such an environment, every member of the group needed to contribute whenever possible. At least, that is what we might expect. But the evidence tells a different story. Archaeologists have discovered Neanderthal skeletons belonging to individuals who lived for years despite severe injuries. Some suffered broken bones that healed successfully. Others experienced injuries that would have made hunting extremely difficult. Some lost mobility. Some endured chronic physical problems. Yet they survived long enough for those injuries to heal. That survival raises an important question. How? A person with a serious injury cannot simply hunt mammoths through determination alone. A badly injured hunter cannot easily travel long distances. Someone suffering from illness cannot always gather food. Recovery requires time. Recovery requires protection. Most importantly, recovery requires other people willing to help. Imagine a Neanderthal camp during winter. Snow covers the landscape. Food remains precious. Every resource matters. One member of the group has been injured during a hunt. Perhaps a fall caused broken ribs. Perhaps an encounter with a large animal resulted in a damaged leg. Whatever the cause, that individual can no longer contribute in the same way as before. The group now faces a choice. Ignore the injured person. Or help them. The archaeological evidence strongly suggests they chose the second option. Food would have been shared. Protection would have been provided. Time would have been given for healing. The injured person remained part of the community. That may sound ordinary today. It was anything but ordinary. Caring for vulnerable individuals requires empathy. It requires cooperation. It requires people willing to invest resources in someone who cannot immediately repay them. Those decisions reveal something important about Neanderthal society. They cared about one another. The same appears true for elderly individuals. Growing old in the Ice Age was no simple achievement. Life was physically demanding. Injuries accumulated. Years of hunting, gathering, carrying, and surviving left their mark on the body. Yet some Neanderthals lived well beyond their most physically productive years. Their value did not disappear simply because their strength declined. Knowledge remained valuable. Experience remained valuable. Memory remained valuable. An elder might know migration routes remembered from decades earlier. They might recognize seasonal patterns younger people had not yet encountered. They might understand where resources could be found during difficult times. In a world without written records, experienced individuals carried enormous amounts of information. They became living libraries. And living libraries are worth protecting. This naturally leads to the subject of friendships and family bonds. Because caring for one another rarely happens in isolation. It develops through relationships. Through trust. Through years of shared experiences. Imagine growing up within a small Neanderthal community. The same faces surround you every day. The same people share meals beside the fire. The same people accompany hunting expeditions. The same people help raise children. The same people face every winter alongside you. Over time, those connections become incredibly strong. Modern friendships often develop through shared interests. Neanderthal friendships likely developed through shared survival. A hunting partner was not simply someone you enjoyed spending time with. A hunting partner might one day save your life. Trust mattered. Reliability mattered. Loyalty mattered. Families formed the foundation of these communities. Parents taught children how to identify tracks. How to use tools. How to recognize useful plants. How to avoid danger. Knowledge flowed constantly between generations. Children learned through observation. Through imitation. Through participation. Every skill required for survival had to be passed forward. That process strengthened family bonds. A child depended upon adults for protection. Adults depended upon children to eventually become capable members of the group. Everyone depended upon everyone else. The result was a deeply interconnected social world. Even simple daily activities helped reinforce these relationships. Gathering around a fire. Sharing meals. Repairing tools together. Telling stories during long evenings. Traveling across the landscape as a group. These experiences created familiarity and trust. Over months. Over years. Over entire lifetimes. Friendships likely extended beyond immediate family members as well. People who hunted together repeatedly developed strong connections. People who gathered resources together developed strong connections. Shared experiences naturally create social bonds. The Ice Age world was dangerous enough. Facing it alone would have been far more dangerous. As darkness settled over the camp and another day came to an end, people gathered around the fire just as they had done countless times before. Children sat beside parents. Elders shared knowledge accumulated over decades. Friends exchanged stories from the day's activities. The flames illuminated familiar faces while cold winds moved through the darkness beyond the shelter. Outside was a world of glaciers, predators, storms, and uncertainty. Inside was something equally important. Community. A network of relationships built through trust, cooperation, and mutual support. And perhaps that is one of the clearest signs that Neanderthals were far more than simple survivors. They cared for injured companions. They supported elderly members of their communities. They formed friendships. They maintained family bonds. They invested in one another. Because in the harsh world of Ice Age Europe, survival was never just about strength. It was about people. If you spent a few days living among a Neanderthal group, one thing would quickly become obvious. These people were talking to one another constantly. Not necessarily in the same language we use today, and certainly not discussing mortgage rates or smartphone updates, but communication was happening everywhere. It had to be. The idea of Neanderthals silently grunting at one another while wandering across Ice Age Europe has largely faded from serious research. Their world was simply too complicated for that. A successful hunt required coordination. Raising children required teaching. Gathering food required sharing information. Caring for injured group members required cooperation. None of those things work very well if your entire vocabulary consists of pointing at things and making confused mammoth noises. Imagine a cold morning beginning to unfold across the camp. The fire from the night before is still glowing faintly beneath a layer of ash. Adults are already awake, feeding small pieces of wood into the embers while children slowly emerge from beneath piles of animal hides. Outside, the landscape remains frozen and silent, but inside the shelter activity is beginning. Someone mentions tracks seen near the river yesterday. Another person gestures toward the valley where reindeer were spotted several days earlier. A young child reaches toward the fire and immediately receives a warning from a nearby adult. Information moves constantly between individuals. Tiny pieces of knowledge flowing back and forth from sunrise until long after darkness returns. Children probably spent much of their early lives listening. Long before they became hunters, gatherers, or toolmakers, they became observers. Every day offered another opportunity to absorb information. A child watching adults prepare stone tools wasn't simply seeing rocks being struck together. They were watching years of experience expressed through action. One carefully placed strike removed a sharp flake. Another refined the shape. Another transformed an ordinary piece of stone into something useful. To an adult the process might appear routine. To a child it was fascinating. Questions were probably endless. Why that stone? Why strike it there? Why not somewhere else? Children in every era seem remarkably talented at asking questions faster than adults can answer them, and there is little reason to believe Neanderthal children were any different. Curiosity is one of the great engines of learning. A child who constantly wants to know how things work eventually begins figuring things out for themselves. As the years passed, lessons became more practical. Young children might accompany adults on short gathering trips close to camp. At first they simply followed along, distracted by interesting rocks, unusual sticks, and whatever mysterious object happened to capture their attention at the moment. Gradually they started noticing what the adults noticed. Certain plants were collected. Others were ignored. Some berries were safe. Others were not. Certain locations reliably provided resources during particular seasons. Knowledge that looked simple on the surface actually represented generations of accumulated experience. The landscape itself became a classroom. Every valley contained lessons. Every river crossing contained lessons. Every animal track pressed into mud or snow contained lessons. Adults did not need formal schools because the world around them supplied a constant stream of educational opportunities. A fresh footprint might lead to a discussion about animal behavior. A change in weather might become a lesson about seasonal patterns. Even mistakes became useful teachers. A child who wandered too far from camp quickly learned the importance of staying close. A child who frightened away a group of animals learned the value of patience. A child who ignored instructions during toolmaking learned why sharp stone and careless fingers are a poor combination. By adolescence, many young Neanderthals were already acquiring skills that modern adults would struggle to master. They could identify tracks that appeared invisible to untrained eyes. They understood seasonal movements of animals. They recognized useful plants. They knew how to maintain fires, prepare hides, and assist with countless daily tasks that kept the community functioning. Much of this knowledge was probably passed on through stories as much as direct instruction. During long evenings around the fire, adults shared memories of hunts, dangerous encounters, harsh winters, and unexpected discoveries. Children listened from nearby, pretending not to be tired while secretly fighting sleep. A story about a hunter following the wrong tracks might contain an important lesson about observation. A story about surviving a difficult winter might teach preparation. A story about an encounter with a cave bear might teach caution without ever sounding like a lecture. The remarkable thing about storytelling is that people often remember stories long after they forget instructions. Facts can fade. Stories tend to linger. Somewhere beside countless Ice Age fires, children were probably learning lessons wrapped inside tales about animals, weather, family members, and adventures that had happened years before they were born. Those stories carried knowledge safely from one generation into the next. And eventually the child sitting beside the fire listening to those stories became the adult telling them. The little boy who once followed experienced hunters now led younger hunters across the landscape. The little girl who once learned where berries grew now taught the same locations to children of her own. Knowledge kept moving forward, flowing through the generations like a river that never stopped. Parents taught children. Elders taught adults. Experience became wisdom. Wisdom became tradition. Tradition became survival. And in a world filled with mammoths, glaciers, predators, and endless uncertainty, that ability to communicate and teach may have been one of the greatest strengths the Neanderthals ever possessed. Death was a familiar visitor in the world of the Neanderthals. It appeared during hunts. It arrived with illness. It followed harsh winters, accidents, and encounters with dangerous animals. Life in Ice Age Europe was difficult enough that every community almost certainly experienced loss on a regular basis. Yet what makes Neanderthals fascinating is not simply that they faced death. Every living thing faces death. What makes them remarkable is the growing evidence that they may have cared deeply about what happened afterward. Imagine a small Neanderthal camp settling into silence after a loss. The fire still burns. The shelters still stand. Children still play nearby. The world continues moving forward exactly as it always has. Mammoths continue their migrations. Reindeer continue crossing the valleys. Snow continues falling across the landscape. Nature shows very little interest in human grief. But people do. Human beings have always struggled with loss. Even today, despite all our technology and knowledge, death remains one of the hardest experiences we face. It is difficult to imagine Neanderthals being entirely different. They lived in close-knit groups. They hunted together. They raised children together. They survived together. Strong social bonds create strong emotions when someone is gone. This is where some of the archaeological evidence becomes particularly intriguing. At several sites, researchers have discovered Neanderthal remains that appear to have been deliberately buried. Rather than simply being left on the landscape, certain individuals seem to have been placed within prepared pits or protected locations. The exact details remain debated among scientists, but the possibility itself raises fascinating questions. Why bury the dead? A practical explanation is certainly possible. Burial may have helped keep predators away from camp. It may have reduced unpleasant odors. It may have been a simple matter of cleanliness. But some researchers wonder if there was more to it. Perhaps these burials carried emotional meaning. Perhaps they reflected respect. Perhaps they reflected grief. Perhaps they reflected beliefs we can no longer fully understand. Imagine a group gathering around a burial site somewhere in Ice Age Europe. The day is cold. The sky is gray. Familiar faces stand quietly nearby. A person who once sat beside the fire, joined hunting expeditions, shared meals, and helped raise children is no longer there. The absence would be impossible to ignore. Someone remembers a successful hunt from years earlier. Someone remembers a story. someone remembers a lesson. Memories remain even when people do not. And that simple fact may have shaped how Neanderthals responded to death. Some discoveries have fueled even more speculation. At a few burial sites, researchers found traces of pollen near skeletal remains. Decades ago, this led to the famous suggestion that flowers may have been placed alongside the dead. Modern interpretations remain cautious because natural processes can also explain pollen deposits, but the idea captured public imagination for a reason. The image feels powerful. A group pausing to place flowers beside someone they cared about. Whether that specific interpretation is correct or not, it reflects a larger possibility. Neanderthals may have possessed emotional lives far richer than people once assumed. And evidence of compassion supports that possibility. One of the most remarkable discoveries involves individuals who survived severe injuries and disabilities for extended periods. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons showing evidence of broken bones, chronic illnesses, missing teeth, and physical conditions that would have made independent survival extremely difficult. Yet these individuals lived. Sometimes for years. Sometimes for decades. That survival did not happen by accident. Imagine an older Neanderthal who has lost many of their teeth. Hunting becomes difficult. Chewing becomes difficult. Daily life becomes more challenging. In a purely selfish society, such an individual might struggle to survive. Yet some did survive. The most likely explanation is simple. Other people helped them. Food was shared. Protection was provided. Care was given. The community invested effort in supporting vulnerable individuals. That is an extraordinary thing when you think about it. Every resource in the Ice Age was valuable. Food required enormous effort to obtain. Energy mattered. Time mattered. Yet people still chose to help those who could no longer contribute in the same ways they once had. Compassion may not leave dramatic archaeological evidence like stone tools or mammoth bones, but occasionally it reveals itself through survival. A healed injury suggests someone lived long enough to recover. A disabled individual reaching old age suggests support from others. A person surviving illness suggests care from the community. The evidence appears again and again. And each example tells a similar story. These people mattered to one another. Imagine a winter evening inside a shelter. Wind howls outside. Snow piles against the landscape. Families gather around the fire. Among them sits an older individual carrying scars from decades of survival. Their hunting days may be behind them. Their body may be worn by years of hardship. Yet they remain part of the group. Children listen when they speak. Adults respect their experience. Food is shared. Warmth is shared. Life is shared. This is not the behavior of isolated individuals concerned only with themselves. It is the behavior of a community. A community capable of empathy. A community capable of remembering. A community capable of caring. As the years passed and generations came and went, countless Neanderthals lived, loved, struggled, taught, learned, and eventually died beneath the vast skies of Ice Age Europe. Most left behind nothing except fragments of bone buried beneath layers of earth. Yet those fragments tell a surprisingly human story. A story of people who cared for injured companions. People who supported the elderly. People who may have buried their dead with intention. People who understood loss because they understood connection. And perhaps that is one of the most powerful lessons the Neanderthals leave behind. For all their physical differences, for all the thousands of years separating their world from ours, the evidence increasingly suggests they experienced something deeply familiar. They formed bonds. They showed compassion. They remembered those they lost. And when death inevitably came, they did not always face it alone. The sun was already beginning its slow descent toward the horizon when the decision was finally made to head back to camp. In the world of the Neanderthals, darkness was not something you ignored. Darkness changed everything. The familiar landscape became unfamiliar. Trails became harder to follow. Hidden dangers became harder to spot. Temperatures dropped rapidly. Predators became more active. Even the most successful hunters understood that staying too far from camp after sunset could quickly become a very bad idea. The journey home often began while there was still enough daylight to travel safely. Hunters gathered their equipment and whatever resources they had managed to acquire during the day. A successful hunt meant carrying heavy loads of meat across considerable distances. Even a gathering trip could leave people returning with bundles of plants, nuts, roots, and useful materials collected throughout the landscape. Nobody moved particularly fast. After an entire day of work, energy was becoming scarce. Legs felt tired. Shoulders ached. Hands were sore. The Ice Age demanded effort from sunrise until sunset, and by evening most people had earned their exhaustion. As they traveled, the landscape slowly transformed beneath the fading light. Long shadows stretched across valleys and grasslands. Frost began forming in shaded areas. The air grew colder with every passing hour. Somewhere in the distance, herds continued their migrations. Birds settled into resting places. The entire world seemed to be preparing for night. The sight of camp appearing on the horizon must have been reassuring. Smoke rising from a fire. Shelters visible against the landscape. Familiar voices. Familiar faces. A place of warmth waiting at the end of a long day. For people who spent their lives surrounded by uncertainty, camp represented security. Not perfect security. But security nonetheless. Children often noticed returning hunters before anyone else. Their attention constantly drifted toward the edges of camp, searching for movement beyond the shelters. The appearance of familiar figures returning from the landscape signaled that another day had ended successfully. The community was together again. That mattered. Because not everyone who left camp was guaranteed to return. The Ice Age could be unforgiving. A twisted ankle miles from shelter. A dangerous animal. A sudden storm. A simple accident. Any of these could transform an ordinary day into a tragedy. Which made every successful return feel significant. As evening settled across the camp, attention gradually shifted toward another important activity. Repairing clothing and tools. The day's work may have ended, but smaller tasks remained. They always remained. Especially during the coldest months. Imagine an experienced adult sitting beside the fire carefully repairing a fur cloak. Bone needles pass through thick hide. Tendons or other natural fibers serve as thread. Each stitch helps restore protection against freezing temperatures. The work requires patience. Precision. Experience. A well-maintained garment could mean the difference between comfort and misery during an Ice Age winter. Tools demanded similar attention. Stone edges gradually became dull. Wooden shafts cracked. Bindings loosened. Damage accumulated through constant use. Every evening presented an opportunity to fix these problems. The rhythmic sounds of maintenance likely became familiar parts of camp life. Stone striking stone. Fibers being tightened. Hides being stitched. Quiet conversations drifting through the shelter while hands remained busy. Children probably watched these activities closely. At first they observed. Then they helped with small tasks. Eventually they learned the skills themselves. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to another. No formal lessons required. The camp itself became the classroom. Repairing equipment was about more than preserving possessions. It was about preparing for survival. Tomorrow's hunt might depend on a reliable spear. Tomorrow's journey might depend on sturdy footwear. Tomorrow's weather might depend on warm clothing. Everything connected together. The people sitting around the fire understood this instinctively. Experience had taught them. Outside, darkness continued spreading across the landscape. The temperature dropped steadily. Wind moved through the valleys. Somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight, wolves began their nightly activities. Other predators emerged from resting places. The wilderness was preparing for another long night. Inside the shelter, however, warmth and activity continued. The day's final repairs were completed. Tools were placed aside. Clothing was folded nearby. The community settled into a quieter rhythm. Food had been gathered. Resources had been processed. Equipment had been maintained. Another day of survival was successfully behind them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow always did. But for now, beside the fire and surrounded by familiar faces, there was a brief moment of comfort before the long Ice Age night truly began. Life during the long Ice Age winters demanded patience in a way that most modern people would find difficult to imagine. Winter was not a brief interruption between comfortable seasons. It was a force that settled across the landscape and refused to leave. As autumn faded and temperatures continued dropping, every member of the Neanderthal camp understood that the hardest months of the year were beginning. The grasslands became coated in frost. Snow gradually covered familiar paths and hunting grounds. Rivers froze along their edges. Trees stood silent beneath cold gray skies. Even the daylight seemed weaker, arriving later each morning and disappearing earlier every evening. The entire world felt slower, colder, and far less forgiving than it had only a few months before. The effects of winter touched every part of daily life. Hunting became more difficult as weather conditions changed and animals adjusted their movements. Gathering plants became increasingly challenging because many resources disappeared beneath snow or simply stopped growing altogether. Travel required greater effort. Every journey demanded more energy. Every mistake carried greater consequences. A person could become dangerously cold far more quickly than during warmer seasons, which meant simple decisions suddenly mattered much more than before. The camp itself became the center of life during these long winter months. People spent more time close together, sheltered from the worst conditions outside. Fires burned constantly whenever fuel was available. Maintaining warmth became one of the most important tasks of the day because warmth meant comfort, but more importantly, warmth meant survival. Every morning began with attention focused on the fire. Embers hidden beneath ash were carefully revived. Small flames became larger flames. Gradually the shelter filled with light and heat once again. Few sights were probably more reassuring than a successful fire returning to life after a long freezing night. Outside the shelter, however, winter continued its work. Cold winds swept across valleys and open plains. Snow drifted against rocks and trees. Animal tracks appeared and disappeared beneath fresh layers of snowfall. The landscape often looked beautiful, but beauty offered little protection against freezing temperatures. The people living within it had learned long ago that admiration alone would not keep anyone alive. As daylight slowly faded each afternoon, another concern began to emerge. Darkness. During the day, the surrounding landscape could be observed clearly. People could see approaching animals. They could identify tracks. They could recognize potential dangers before those dangers became immediate threats. Night changed everything. Visibility vanished. Familiar terrain became uncertain. Shadows swallowed the landscape. The world beyond the shelter entrance transformed into a place filled with possibilities, not all of them pleasant. This was also the time when predators became more active. Somewhere beyond the camp, wolves were moving through the snow. Their paws carried them silently across frozen ground as they searched for opportunities. Cave hyenas wandered across the landscape using powerful senses to locate food. Large cats remained hidden in darkness, patient and watchful. The Ice Age world contained no shortage of creatures capable of causing problems for anyone caught alone after sunset. Imagine the evening settling over the camp. The last traces of daylight disappear beyond the horizon. The temperature falls rapidly. People gather closer to the fire. Food is prepared. Conversations become quieter. Children move nearer to parents. The glow of the flames creates a circle of warmth and visibility within an ocean of darkness. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a sound emerges. A wolf howl. Long and low. Carried across the frozen landscape by the wind. Everyone hears it. Nobody reacts with surprise. Sounds like these are familiar. Yet familiarity does not mean indifference. The howl serves as a reminder. The camp is not alone. Something is moving through the darkness. Something is hunting. The fire suddenly feels even more important. Fire provided more than warmth. It created a boundary. Most predators preferred avoiding bright flames whenever possible. Firelight announced that the camp was occupied. It revealed movement. It reduced opportunities for surprise. While no protection was perfect, a strong fire significantly improved safety during the night. People understood this instinctively. Wood was added regularly. The flames were monitored carefully. Nobody wanted the fire to fade completely before morning. Imagine looking beyond the edge of that firelight. The farther your eyes travel, the less you can see. Shapes become uncertain. Shadows blend together. The darkness seems endless. Somewhere out there, predators continue their nightly activities completely unseen. Wolves may be crossing a nearby ridge. A hyena may be following an animal trail. A large cat may be resting beneath a rocky outcrop. The people inside the shelter know these creatures exist even if they cannot see them. Which is precisely why they remain together. Community was one of the greatest defenses available. A single individual alone in the darkness was vulnerable. A group gathered around a fire inside a shelter presented a far more difficult challenge. Predators generally preferred easier opportunities whenever they could find them. That preference worked in the Neanderthals' favor. As the evening continues, the sounds of the wilderness occasionally drift through the darkness. A distant howl. The crack of ice. Wind moving through the landscape. Every sound reminds the people inside that the world beyond the shelter remains active throughout the night. Life does not stop simply because humans are resting. Eventually conversations grow quieter. The fire settles into a steady rhythm of glowing embers and dancing flames. Families wrap themselves in animal hides. Children drift toward sleep. Adults remain aware of their surroundings even as exhaustion from the day's work begins to take hold. Outside, winter continues. Predators continue. The ice age continues. But inside the shelter there is warmth. There is safety. There is familiarity. The fire still burns. Family members remain nearby. The challenges of tomorrow can wait until morning. For now, another winter night has been successfully endured, and in the harsh world of Neanderthal Europe, that alone is something worth appreciating. The fire continued to crackle at the center of the shelter while the last traces of food disappeared from wooden hands and stone surfaces. Nobody rushed anywhere because there was nowhere to rush to. Outside, darkness had already spread across the Ice Age landscape, swallowing the valleys, rivers, forests, and hunting grounds that had occupied everyone's attention only hours earlier. The day's work was finished now. The reindeer tracks could wait until morning. The damaged spear could wait until morning. Even the endless struggle against the cold seemed slightly less urgent while the fire remained strong and the shelter remained warm. For a little while, people simply sat where they were, enjoying something that was surprisingly rare in the Ice Age world. A moment without immediate danger. Children were usually the last to surrender to exhaustion. They lingered beside parents and older relatives, listening to conversations they only partly understood. One moment they were wide awake, staring into the flames as stories drifted through the shelter. The next moment their heads began to droop. Their eyes stayed closed a little longer each time they blinked. Eventually gravity won the argument. Small bodies leaned against parents, siblings, or piles of animal hides, drifting towards sleep without even realizing it. Adults noticed, of course. They always did. A child who had spent the day exploring the edges of camp, asking endless questions, and running between activities could only stay awake for so long. As the younger members of the group disappeared into sleep one by one, the shelter itself seemed to grow quieter. Voices became softer. Movements became slower. Someone shifted closer to the fire. Someone else stretched sore muscles after a day spent carrying meat across frozen ground. The warmth from the flames still reached every corner of the shelter, but nobody trusted warmth to last forever. Ice Age nights were cold in a way most modern people never experience. The cold was patient. It waited outside the shelter walls, pressing against layers of hide and wood, looking for every opportunity to creep back inside. That was one reason sleeping arrangements mattered so much. People did not simply collapse wherever they happened to be sitting. Warmth was too valuable for that. Families naturally grouped together. Parents remained close to children. Younger members occupied the safest positions. Animal hides were spread carefully across the ground to create barriers between sleeping bodies and the frozen earth below. Every layer mattered. Every piece of fur trapped a little more heat. Every sleeping body contributed a little warmth to the people nearby. Survival often depended upon details that seemed insignificant until the temperature dropped far below freezing. Gradually the shelter transformed. What had been a place filled with conversation only an hour earlier became a place filled with breathing. The fire still crackled occasionally. Embers shifted and glowed red beneath dark layers of ash. A sleeping child rolled over beneath a fur covering. An adult adjusted a cloak before settling into a more comfortable position. Beyond that, very little moved. The camp had finally reached the point where exhaustion overcame activity. After spending an entire day hunting, gathering, repairing, carrying, teaching, and surviving, rest was no longer optional. It was necessary. Outside, wolves were probably moving through the darkness at that very moment. Somewhere a herd of reindeer continued its migration beneath the stars. Snow drifted across empty plains. Wind swept across frozen valleys exactly as it had the night before and exactly as it would tomorrow night. The Ice Age never stopped. It never rested. Yet inside the shelter, protected by firelight and surrounded by familiar faces, a Neanderthal family could finally close their eyes for a few precious hours, knowing that the hunt, the cold, and the endless demands of survival would still be waiting when the sun returned. Sleep eventually settled across the shelter, but the challenges of the Ice Age did not disappear simply because people closed their eyes. Outside, the wind continued moving across frozen valleys and open grasslands. Snow drifted against rocks and trees. Wolves traveled beneath the stars. Somewhere far beyond the reach of the campfire, mammoths continued their slow migrations through the darkness. The world remained active even while the Neanderthal family slept. Inside the shelter, the fire burned lower with every passing hour. Embers glowed softly beneath a blanket of ash, providing just enough warmth to keep the worst of the cold away. Animal hides covered sleeping bodies. Parents rested beside children. Older members of the group slept nearby. Everyone remained close together because closeness meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. What happened inside their minds while they slept remains one of the great mysteries of prehistory. Did Neanderthals dream? Almost certainly. Modern humans dream. Dreams appear deeply connected to the way brains process experiences, memories, emotions, and fears. Neanderthals possessed brains that were at least as large as our own and lived lives filled with intense experiences. It would be surprising if those experiences simply disappeared when sleep arrived. Imagine a hunter dreaming about a mammoth encountered earlier that day. The enormous animal appears once again, larger than life, moving through a snowy landscape. A gathering trip becomes mixed with memories from childhood. Familiar faces appear beside the fire. Places merge together. Events unfold that never actually happened. Dreams have always been strange. The Ice Age probably did nothing to change that. Children may have experienced dreams filled with adventure and curiosity. Adults may have dreamed about hunts, storms, missing family members, or dangerous animals. Some dreams were probably pleasant. Others were almost certainly frightening. Fear was an unavoidable part of life. Not constant panic. Not endless terror. Just an awareness that the world could be dangerous. A hunter leaving camp before sunrise understood that accidents could happen. A parent raising children understood that illness could appear unexpectedly. An elder remembered winters that had been harsher than usual. Everyone carried concerns. Everyone carried uncertainties. The difference was that those fears were often very real. A poor hunting season could threaten survival. A serious injury could change a person's life. An early winter storm could create enormous difficulties. The Ice Age rewarded preparation but offered very few guarantees. And yet, despite those fears, life continued. Morning always returned. Eventually the first signs of dawn appeared beyond the shelter entrance. Darkness retreated slowly. The stars faded. The horizon brightened. One person stirred awake. Then another. Children remained asleep slightly longer, wrapped beneath layers of fur while adults began preparing for another day. The fire needed attention first. It always did. Someone carefully exposed the surviving embers. Dry fuel was added. A small flame appeared. Then another. Soon the shelter once again filled with warmth and light. A complete day in the life of a Neanderthal family was beginning. Children slowly emerged from sleep, rubbing tired eyes while the camp came alive around them. Adults checked equipment. Hunters discussed plans. Gatherers prepared for journeys into the surrounding landscape. Food remaining from previous meals was shared. The familiar rhythm of survival resumed almost immediately. Nobody knew exactly what the day would bring. Perhaps hunters would find reindeer tracks. Perhaps they would discover a mammoth herd. Perhaps weather conditions would change unexpectedly. Perhaps gathering parties would return with valuable resources. Every day contained possibilities. Every day contained risks. The family moved through these challenges together. Children learned by watching. Adults taught through action. Elders contributed knowledge gathered over decades of experience. The community functioned because everyone played a role. As the sun climbed higher, some members disappeared into the landscape carrying spears and tools. Others searched for plants, roots, nuts, and useful materials. Children remained close to experienced adults, gradually absorbing the countless lessons necessary for survival. The hours passed. Work continued. The world demanded effort, and effort was given. Eventually afternoon arrived. Then evening. The hunters returned. The gatherers returned. Food was shared. Stories were exchanged. Tools were repaired. The fire became the center of life once again. Children listened. Adults talked. The shelter filled with warmth while darkness gathered outside. And without anyone really noticing, the cycle that had begun at dawn was already approaching its end. Another day had been completed. Another day had been survived. The fears had not vanished. The challenges had not disappeared. Tomorrow would bring new uncertainties, new hunts, new dangers, and new opportunities. But for now, surrounded by family, protected by firelight, and sheltered from the cold world beyond, the Neanderthals could rest knowing they had accomplished the same thing their ancestors had accomplished for thousands of years before them. They had made it through another day.